Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into a world that feels almost impossible to believe. A world where young women were sent to grand estates, not to study mathematics or science, but to learn how to walk gracefully downstairs, how to eat an orange with a knife and fork without touching it with their hands, and how to be interesting enough for a husband, but not so intelligent that they might frighten him away. These were the finishing schools, and for nearly 2 centuries they shaped the lives of countless young women, from American heiresses to European princesses. But what really happened behind those elegant doors? What were these mysterious institutions really teaching? And why did some students love them, while others begged to escape? Before we step through those polished mahogany doors together, I have a small request. If this story speaks to you, if it makes you think or feel something, please consider subscribing to this channel. A like would mean the world to me, and sharing this with someone who loves history would help us keep these forgotten stories alive. And I am genuinely curious, where are you right now as you listen to this? Are you in bed, on a late-night drive, or perhaps folding laundry at midnight? Drop a comment and let me know. Your presence here matters more than you might think. Now, dim those lights if you can. Let the world get quiet around you and settle in. We have quite a story to explore tonight. Picture this. It is a crisp autumn morning in 1875. A young woman, perhaps 16 or 17 years old, steps out of a horse-drawn carriage. She is standing before an imposing Victorian mansion somewhere in the English countryside. The building is beautiful, yes, but also somewhat intimidating. She clutches a small leather suitcase, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and dread. This is her finishing school. This is where she will spend the next 6 months, or perhaps a full year, learning to become, as they say, a proper lady. Now, here is what makes this moment so fascinating. This young woman might be the daughter of a wealthy merchant, an earl, or even a member of a royal family. But regardless of her background, she is here for one very specific purpose. Not to prepare for university, not to develop a career, but to be finished, to be polished and perfected for her eventual role as someone's wife. Let me share something with you that I find absolutely remarkable. The term finishing school itself tells us so much. Think about it for a moment. These institutions were called finishing schools because they came after regular education. They were meant to put the final touches on a young woman's upbringing, like the last coat of varnish on a fine piece of furniture, or the final polish on a gemstone. The message was clear. Your basic education is complete. Now we will teach you what really matters. And what did really matter? Well, that is where things get interesting. You see, finishing schools were not all the same. There are actually 3 distinct types, and understanding this helps us see just how complex this world really was. First, there were the schools for the truly wealthy, the upper crust of society. These institutions focused almost entirely on social graces. Think about young women practicing the perfect curtsy for hours, learning to play Chopin on the piano, speaking flawless French and Italian, arranging flowers into breathtaking displays, and mastering the art of conversation, that delicate balance of being charming without being too clever, engaging without being too bold. Then there were finishing schools for the middle classes, families who had money but were not quite part of high society. These schools taught etiquette and deportment, absolutely. But they also included more practical skills. Dressmaking, so a woman could maintain her wardrobe. Housewifery, the art of managing servants and running a household efficiently. Even typing and shorthand, just in case, heaven forbid, a woman might need to support herself one day. And finally, there were the academic finishing schools, and these were truly revolutionary for their time. Places like Queen's College in London, founded in 1848, or the Cheltenham Ladies' College, established in 1854. These schools dared to teach women actual subjects. History, not just dates to memorize, but real analysis. Literature, philosophy, even mathematics. These were the rebels of the finishing school world, and they faced enormous criticism for it. Now, I want you to imagine the contrast for a moment. While boys of the same age and social class were at places like Eton or Harrow, studying Latin and Greek, preparing for Oxford or Cambridge, learning to debate and think critically, girls were learning which fork to use for fish and how to enter a drawing room with perfect posture. The inequality is stunning when you really stop to think about it. But here is something that might surprise you. Switzerland. Yes, Switzerland became the absolute epicenter of finishing school culture, especially by the early 20th century. And the story of how that happened is fascinating. In the 1920s, the city of Lausanne alone, this beautiful Swiss city overlooking Lake Geneva, was home to 45 finishing schools. 45. Can you imagine? The lakeside was dotted with grand villas and chateaux, each one filled with young women from across Europe and America, all there to be polished into perfection. Why Switzerland? Well, think about it. The country had not been involved in a war for 500 years. It was neutral, peaceful, safe. It had stunning natural beauty, the kind that made for perfect Instagram photos, if Instagram had existed then. The Swiss Alps provided opportunities for skiing, which was considered a very fashionable and aristocratic sport. And Switzerland was multilingual. You could learn French, German and Italian all in one place. For wealthy families, it was the perfect finishing school destination. One institution stands above all the rest. Institut Villa Pierrefeu, founded in 1954 in Glion, a village perched high above Montreux. The villa itself was built in 1911 for a Dutch baroness. A stunning chalet with breathtaking views of Lake Geneva and the Alps beyond. This school, and let me tell you, this detail absolutely fascinates me. This school is still operating today. It is the last remaining traditional finishing school in Switzerland. The very last one. Let that sink in for a moment. In the 1920s, there were dozens upon dozens of these institutions across Switzerland. By the 1990s, they had nearly all closed their doors, but Institut Villa Pierrefeu survived. And we will talk more about how and why later in our journey tonight. But before we continue, I want to share something personal with you. When I first started researching finishing schools, I expected to find them ridiculous, even offensive. And in many ways, they were both of those things. The whole concept of training women to be decorative and agreeable rather than educated and independent, it goes against everything we value today. But the more I learned, the more complex the picture became. Because here is the thing. These young women, they were not passive participants in some cruel system. Many of them were intelligent, ambitious, curious. They were working within the constraints of their time, using the tools available to them. And some of the schools, particularly the more academic ones, were actually quite subversive. They were giving women knowledge and confidence in an era when society actively discouraged both. Take the Reading Abbey Girls' School, for example. This institution, which operated between 1755 and 1794, was remarkable. Jane Austen herself, yes, that Jane Austen, attended this school in 1785 and 1786. Her father, a rector of modest means, made enormous financial sacrifices to send both Jane and her sister Cassandra there. This was a finishing school experience usually reserved for wealthier families, but he believed in its value. And what made this school special? It had an absolutely stellar faculty. François-Pierre Pictet, who had been secretary to Catherine the Great of Russia and an associate of Voltaire, taught there. The curriculum included not just the expected music and dancing, but also Greek and Latin, subjects that were supposed to be only for boys. They taught rhetoric, poetry, modern and ancient languages. One teacher, Frances Arabella Rowden, had a particular gift. She made poets out of her students, not just young women who could recite poetry prettily, but actual published poets. Letitia Elizabeth Landon, one of the most famous poets of her era, was shaped by her time at this school. So you see, finishing schools existed on a spectrum. On one end, you had institutions that were little more than marriage factories, teaching girls to be ornamental and obedient. On the other end, you had schools that were quietly revolutionary, giving women intellectual tools they were not supposed to have. Now, I want to paint you a picture of what a rival day might have looked like at one of these schools. Close your eyes, if you are able, and imagine this with me. You are stepping into a world frozen in time, a world of rules and rituals that would shape every moment of your day for months to come. The entrance hall is magnificent. Polished wood floors that gleam in the afternoon light, a grand staircase curving upward, oil paintings of stern-looking women in elaborate dresses lining the walls. Perhaps these are former headmistress or particularly distinguished alumni. The air smells of beeswax polish and fresh flowers, always fresh flowers, perfectly arranged in crystal vases. A woman approaches you. She is impeccably dressed, every hair in place, her posture so perfect it makes your back hurt just looking at her. She is the headmistress, or perhaps her assistant. She does not smile, not really. She examines you with eyes that miss nothing. Your posture, your dress, the way you are holding your hands. You suddenly become painfully aware of every awkward thing about yourself. She speaks. Her voice is cultured, cool, utterly controlled. "Welcome," she says. "You have come here to be finished. By the time you leave this institution, you will walk differently, speak differently, think differently. You'll be ready to take your place in society. You'll be ready to be a credit to your family and, eventually, to your husband." Can you feel the weight of those words, the pressure? And then you are shown to your room. It might be a small single room, or more likely a dormitory you will share with 3 or 4 other girls. The beds are narrow, the blankets thin. There is a small wardrobe for your clothes, a washstand with a porcelain basin and pitcher. The windows overlook the grounds, perhaps a manicured garden, or, if you're lucky enough to be in Switzerland, a spectacular mountain vista. This is where you will sleep, sternly write letters home. This is where you will cry into your pillow on homesick nights. This is where you will whisper and giggle with the other girls after lights out, sharing secrets and dreams and fears. The rules are explained to you, and there are so many rules. You must rise at 6 in the morning every morning. No exceptions. You must keep your back straight at all times, whether sitting, standing, or walking. No slouching, ever. You must speak in a modulated tone, never raising your voice, never laughing too loudly. Ladies do not make noise. You must learn to move silently, to glide rather than walk heavily. You must practice entering and exiting rooms with grace. You must master the art of sitting down and standing up without making it look like an effort. And here is a detail that I find both fascinating and slightly heartbreaking. If you broke these rules, if you soured or spoke too loudly or moved too quickly, there were consequences. Girls were sometimes denied dinner, not as a single punishment, but for weeks at a time. Can you imagine being a teenager, growing, active, and being refused food because you forgot a date in a history lesson or because you laughed too enthusiastically? One account describes a girl who was punished by her governess so severely for these small infractions that she became afraid to speak up about anything. Her parents actively discouraged her from complaining. They told her to endure it, to learn her lessons, to be grateful for the opportunity. The psychological impact of this must have been profound, but here is what strikes me most powerfully about all of this. Despite the restrictions, despite the often absurd rules, despite the clear purpose of making women into decorative objects for men to marry, something unexpected happened in these schools. Friendships formed. deep, lasting friendships between girls who understood each other's struggles. Women found ways to support each other, to protect each other, to create small rebellions within the constraints they faced. And in some of these schools, particularly the better ones, women discovered something remarkable. They discovered their own capabilities. They learned that they were intelligent, talented, capable of so much more than society would ever ask of them. And that knowledge, once gained, could never be fully suppressed. Think about the paradox here. You send a girl to finishing school to make her marriageable, to polish her into the perfect wife. But in doing so, you bring her together with dozens of other intelligent young women. You give her time to read, to think, to talk with her peers. You introduce her to teachers, many of whom are unmarried women who have made their own way in the world. You show her, perhaps unintentionally, that there are other possibilities. This is the secret world of finishing schools, not just the rules and the deportment lessons and the flower arranging, but also the friendships, the quiet rebellions, the moments of intellectual awakening, the complex, contradictory reality of being a young woman in a world that wanted you to be both educated and ignorant, accomplished and humble, interesting and silent, all at the same time. So now you have glimpsed the world of finishing schools. You understand what they were, why they existed, and the contradictions at their heart. But what was daily life actually like for the students who lived in these institutions? What did a typical day look like from the moment they woke up until they went to bed? The routines, the lessons, the endless rules. That is where our journey takes us next. And I promise you, some of what you are about to discover will surprise you. The level of control, the strange lessons, the exhausting expectations, but also the moments of joy, the secret friendships, and the small acts of resistance that made life bearable. Stay with me as we step inside a day in the life of a finishing school student. The morning bell rings at precisely 6 o'clock, not a minute earlier, not a minute later. In the dormitory rooms across the school, young women jolt awake from their narrow beds, the thin blankets offering little warmth against the early morning chill. There is no snooze button in a Victorian finishing school. There is no sleeping in, no matter how tired you might be, no matter how much you might long for just 10 more minutes of rest. This is where our journey takes us now, into the daily rhythm of life inside these institutions. And I have to tell you, when I first read accounts of a typical day at a finishing school, I was absolutely exhausted just imagining it. The schedule was relentless, every minute accounted for, every moment designed to shape, correct, and refine. Let me walk you through it, hour by hour, so you can truly feel what it was like. 6 in the morning. You climb out of bed, your feet touching the cold wooden floor. There is a washstand in the corner with a porcelain basin and a pitcher of water. The water is ice cold. There is no hot water for washing, not for the students. You splash your face, trying to wake yourself up fully, and you dress quickly in the chill of the early morning. Your clothes must be perfect. Every button fastened correctly, every ribbon tied just so. A teacher will inspect you later, and heaven help you if something is out of place. By 6:30, you are expected to be dressed and ready for morning exercises. Now, these are not the kind of exercise you might be imagining. No running, no vigorous activity, nothing that might cause you to perspire too heavily or become unladylike. Instead, you practice deportment. This is the art of carrying yourself with perfect posture and grace. Picture 20 young women standing in a large room, each with a heavy book balanced on her head. The teacher walks between them, watching like a hawk. Stand straighter, shoulders back, chin level with the floor. Now walk, slowly, gracefully. Do not let that book fall. If it falls, you start again and again and again. I know this sounds almost comical, walking with books on your head. It has become such a cliché, such a joke in movies and television shows. But here is the thing. For these young women, this was deadly serious. Their entire future, as they understood it, depended on mastering these skills. A woman who slouched, who walked heavily, who carried herself awkwardly, she would not attract the right kind of husband. She would embarrass her family in society. She might end up, horror of horrors, unmarried. So they practiced, hour after hour, day after day, until moving with perfect posture became second nature. 7 o'clock brings breakfast, and even this is a lesson. The dining hall is arranged with formal place settings. Multiple forks, multiple spoons, different knives for different courses, crystal glasses for water and wine, napkins that must be unfolded in exactly the right way and placed precisely on your lap. You sit down, back straight, never letting your spine touch the back of the chair. You wait for the headmistress to begin eating before you touch your own food. And then you navigate the meal like a minefield. Which fork for the fruit? How do you butter your bread without looking clumsy? How do you cut your meat into appropriate bite-sized pieces? How do you bring the soup spoon to your mouth without slurping, without spilling, without making any sound at all? And here is where things get truly fascinating. There was an entire class devoted to what they called tricky foods. This was a real class, I promise you. Students would learn how to eat difficult foods with absolute grace and propriety. An orange must be peeled and sectioned using only a knife and fork, never touching it with your hands. An apple must be cored and sliced the same way. A kiwi fruit, slippery and awkward, must be conquered with silverware alone. Can you imagine the concentration this required? The focus. You are trying to eat, to nourish yourself, but every movement is being watched and judged. One wrong move, one small mistake, and you're corrected in front of all the other students. After breakfast comes the academic portion of the morning, though academic is perhaps too generous a word for many of these schools. From 8 until noon, you might have French conversation practice. Not French grammar or literature, mind you, just conversation. Learning to make pleasant small talk in French about the weather, about fashion, about safe, unchallenging topics. You might have elocution lessons where a teacher helps you perfect your accent and diction. Any regional accent must be eliminated. Any trace of your background must be smoothed away. You must sound refined, cultured, upper class. The teacher makes you repeat phrases over and over. How now, brown cow? The rain in Spain stays mainly in the plain. Your mouth must form the words in exactly the right way. Music lessons fill several hours each week. Almost every finishing schoolgirl learned piano, some learned harp. A few learned to sing, though not too loudly, never too boldly. The purpose of these skills was not artistic expression. No one cared if you felt the music deeply or wanted to compose your own pieces. The purpose was to be able to entertain guests in your future home, to play pretty background music while others conversed, to be decorative and accomplished without being threatening or too talented. Let me share with you something that one woman, Mary Somerville, wrote about her experience at a Scottish boarding school for girls in the early 1800s. She said, and I am paraphrasing here, that the chief thing she had to do was learn by heart a page of Dr. Johnson's dictionary every day, just memorizing definitions with no context, no application, no understanding of why this mattered. It was education as an empty exercise, knowledge without purpose. This captures something essential about many of these schools: the appearance of learning without the substance, the performance of accomplishment without the reality. But let me be fair here. Not all finishing schools were like this. Some, particularly by the mid to late 1800s, began to offer more rigorous academics. The North London Collegiate School, started by Miss Frances Mary Buss in 1850, was revolutionary. It was the first public day school for girls in England, and it offered a curriculum similar to what boys were learning: real mathematics, real science, real literature and history. Cheltenham Ladies' College, where Miss Dorothea Beale served as headmistress starting in 1858, was another beacon of academic seriousness. These schools proved that young women were just as capable of intellectual work as young men. They graduated students who went on to universities, to careers, to lives beyond marriage and motherhood. But those were the exceptions. For most finishing school students, the morning academic hours were light on actual academics and heavy on accomplishments. Noon brings luncheon, another elaborate meal with more etiquette practice. And then, mercifully, comes a brief period of free time, perhaps an hour, maybe 2 if you're lucky. This is when friendships truly form. You and the other girls might walk in the gardens if the weather is fine. You might gather in someone's room to whisper and giggle. You might write letters home, though be careful what you say because the teachers sometimes read them before they are sent. These friendships, I think, were the saving grace of the whole experience. When everything else was restrictive and exhausting, you had your fellow students, girls who understood exactly what you were going through because they were going through it too. You shared secrets, dreams, complaints. You helped each other with difficult lessons. You covered for each other when someone broke a rule. There are accounts of girls at finishing schools forming bonds that lasted their entire lives. Friendships that began over shared frustration with a particularly strict teacher or a particularly absurd rule. These relationships were real, deep, sustaining. The afternoon brings more lessons, watercolour painting because a lady should be able to make pretty pictures, flower arranging, an art form taken incredibly seriously. You learn which flowers complement each other, how to create balanced compositions, how to arrange them in vases so they look effortless even though you have laboured over them for an hour. Needlework fills many afternoon hours, embroidery, fine sewing, perhaps some dressmaking. Some schools taught this as a practical skill, something you might actually use. Others taught it more as a meditation on patience and attention to detail. Look how carefully this young lady can create tiny, perfect stitches. Surely she will be just as careful and patient in managing a household. Now, here is something that struck me as particularly telling. Dancing lessons were a crucial part of the curriculum at almost every finishing school. But not just any dancing. Ballroom dancing, the waltz, the quadrille, the polka. You needed to know these dances because this was how you would meet potential husbands. The social season in London, those months when aristocratic families gathered for balls and parties, that was where marriages were made. And you needed to know how to move gracefully across a dance floor in the arms of a young man you had just met. The teachers would sometimes play the role of male dance partners, or if the school was progressive, they might bring in young men from a nearby boys' school for practice. Can you imagine the anxiety of these lessons? The awkwardness? You are 16 or 17, still growing into your own body, and you're supposed to glide elegantly across a floor while making pleasant conversation and not stepping on anyone's toes. Dinner is served at 6 or 7 in the evening, another formal meal with more rules, more observation, and after dinner, there might be a brief period of recreation, reading, though only appropriate books, certainly not novels that were too romantic or too exciting, playing quiet parlour games, more conversation practice. By 9 o'clock you are expected to be in your room. By 9:30 lights out, and you lie in your narrow bed exhausted thinking about tomorrow when the whole routine begins again. But here is what I want you to understand. Within this rigid structure, within this relentless schedule, there were moments of rebellion, small acts of defiance that kept the spirit alive. Girls would stay up past lights out, whispering in the dark. They would smuggle in forbidden books, novels they were not supposed to read, and pass them secretly from hand to hand. They would mock the stricter teachers behind their backs, creating nicknames and inside jokes. They would deliberately make small mistakes in their deportment lessons just to see how long it took before someone noticed. These were not great dramatic rebellions. No one was setting fires or running away, well, not often anyway. But they were acts of resistance nonetheless. Ways of saying I am more than what you're trying to make me. I have thoughts and feelings and desires that do not fit into your perfect little boxes. And some teachers, the good ones, the ones who actually cared about their students as human beings rather than as projects to be perfected, they quietly encouraged this spirit. Frances Arabella Rowden at Reading Abbey Girls' School, the teacher who had a knack of making poets of her pupils, she understood that creativity and conformity were not the same thing. She pushed her students to think, to write, to express themselves even within the constraints of the institution. Think about the contradiction here. You are being taught to be silent, decorative, agreeable, but your teacher is asking you to write poetry, to have opinions, to develop your own voice. That subtle subversion, that quiet revolution, it must have been confusing but also thrilling. Now let me share something that makes my heart ache a little. There were punishments, sometimes severe ones, for breaking the rules. I mentioned earlier that girls could be denied dinner for weeks if they made mistakes in their lessons, but it went beyond that. There was a practice called being sent down, which was essentially being expelled, sent home in disgrace, or rusticated, which meant being suspended, or gated, which meant being confined to your room or to the school grounds, unable to leave even for walks or outings. But perhaps worse than the official punishments were the psychological ones, being made to feel stupid, clumsy, unworthy, having your mistakes pointed out in front of everyone, being told again and again that you were not good enough, not graceful enough, not accomplished enough, not pretty enough, not quiet enough. One account describes a girl who was so harshly criticized by her governess that she became terrified to speak up about anything. When the abuse got worse, when she was denied meals for increasingly minor infractions, she did not tell her parents. Why? Because they had already made it clear that she should not complain, that she should be grateful for the opportunity, that she should simply endure and learn. Can you imagine carrying that burden, being treated badly and feeling like you cannot even ask for help? And yet, and this is what amazes me, many women looked back on their finishing school years with complicated feelings. Yes, it was restrictive. Yes, it was often absurd. Yes, it reinforced terrible ideas about women's roles and capabilities. But it was also where they made their closest friends, where they had time to read and think without the responsibilities of adult life, where they were, in some strange way, free from the expectations of being daughters at home or wives to husbands. It was a liminal space, not quite childhood, not quite adulthood, a strange bubble where they existed in this highly controlled environment, but also, paradoxically, had a kind of independence they might never have again. So when you ask what daily life was like in a finishing school, the answer is complicated. It was exhausting and exhilarating, restrictive and occasionally liberating, silly and serious. It was all of these things at once, depending on the school, the teachers, the students, the particular moment in time. We have walked through a full day now from that 6 o'clock wake-up bell to lights out at 9:30. We have seen the lessons, the meals, the endless practice of skills that seem so strange to us now, but there is still so much to explore. Because what exactly were they teaching in these classrooms? What was the actual curriculum? The classes had names like deportment and etiquette and accomplishments, but what did those words really mean? What did a lesson in conversation or tricky foods actually look like? And why? Why was all of this considered so essential? That is where we venture next, into the heart of the curriculum itself, into the fascinating, bizarre, contradictory world of what finishing schools actually taught, and I promise some of what you will discover is going to surprise you. There was a class that actually existed, taught in multiple finishing schools across Europe and America, called the Art of the Table. Not just table manners, mind you, the art. As if eating a meal were a performance requiring years of study and practice, and in a way I suppose it was. Let me take you inside one of these lessons, because this is where the curriculum becomes absolutely fascinating. where the contradictions we have been talking about come into sharp, almost painful focus. Imagine a classroom that looks more like a formal dining room. A long mahogany table set with gleaming silverware, crystal glasses catching the afternoon light, fine china plates arranged with mathematical precision. 20 young women seated around this table, backs perfectly straight, hands folded in their laps, waiting for the lesson to begin. The instructor, a woman perhaps in her 50s, impeccably dressed, walks slowly around the table. Her eyes miss nothing. She begins to speak, her voice carrying that particular tone of someone who believes absolutely in the importance of what she is teaching. Today, she says, we will learn the proper protocol for a 7-course dinner. You will be expected to know which utensil to use for each course, how to signal to the servants when you have finished eating, how to engage in pleasant conversation without allowing your food to grow cold, and how to navigate the entire meal without making a single sound that might call attention to yourself. 7 courses, let that sink in for a moment. 7 separate courses, each with its own specific fork, knife or spoon, each with its own rules about how it should be eaten. And you, as a young woman of refinement, were expected to know all of this instinctively, to make it look effortless. The first course might be oysters. Now, do you know how to eat an oyster properly? You must use the small oyster fork, which is the tiniest fork at your place setting. You spear the oyster delicately, never stabbing at it. You bring it to your mouth without dripping any liquid. You eat it in one bite, and you do not, under any circumstances, make any expression that suggests you might not enjoy it, even if oysters make you want to gag. Next comes soup. This is where things get truly intricate. The soup spoon must be held in a specific way. You dip it into the soup, moving away from yourself, not toward yourself. You fill it only about 2/3 full. You bring it to your lips. You do not lower your head to the spoon. And the sound, oh, the horror of making any sound while eating soup. Absolute silence was required, not a slurp, not a sip, nothing. One finishing school actually kept a record of infractions, marking down each time that a student made a noise while eating. Girls would be fined, not with money, but with demerits, black marks against their record. Too many demerits and you might be sent home, your reputation ruined, your family's investment in your education wasted. After the soup came fish, and this required yet another specialized set of utensils, the fish knife and fish fork, which have a slightly different shape than the meat knife and fork. You had to learn to debone a fish at the table without making it look difficult, without leaving bits of bone on your plate in an unsightly way. Some schools actually practiced this with actual fish, while others used painted wooden models. Hour after hour of carefully separating flesh from bone with the wrong utensils, because heaven forbid you should use your fingers. Then meat, then a palate cleanser, then a salad course, then dessert, each one with its own rules, its own potential for embarrassment. But here is what strikes me as most revealing about these lessons. They were teaching table manners to girls who came from wealthy families that certainly already ate formal dinners at home. These young women were not complete novices. They'd been eating with proper utensils their entire lives. So why the intensive training? Why the endless practice? Because it was not really about the food at all. It was about demonstrating that you had been properly educated, that you had attended the right schools, moved in the right circles, absorbed the right knowledge. Table manners were a code, a secret language that separated the truly refined from the merely wealthy. And this brings us to something even more peculiar. Conversation class. Yes, there were actual classes devoted to teaching young women how to make conversation. Not what to talk about necessarily, but how to talk. The tone, the rhythm, the art of being engaging without being too interesting. Intelligent without being intimidating. The rules for conversation were exhaustive. Never interrupt a man when he is speaking. Always appear interested in what others are saying, even if you are bored to tears. Have opinions but not strong ones. Be able to discuss literature but not in too much depth. Mention music, art, travel, but always in a way that invites others to speak rather than dominating the conversation yourself. There was this delicate balance you had to strike. John Ruskin, a prominent Victorian writer, actually wrote about women's education. He believed that a woman should be educated enough to have an intelligent conversation with her husband, to share his interests and understand his work, but not so educated that she might challenge him, compete with him, or make him feel intellectually inferior. Can you feel the impossibility of this? You are supposed to be a perfect companion, interesting enough to be worth talking to, but not so interesting that you overshadowed the men in your life. Smart enough to understand, but not so smart that you might have your own ideas. In conversation classes, teachers would actually role-play different social scenarios. You might practice what to say when introduced to a duchess, how to gracefully change the subject if someone brought up something inappropriate, how to fill an awkward silence without seeming desperate or foolish, how to excuse yourself from a conversation politely when you needed to move to another part of the room. And then there were the subjects you were absolutely forbidden to discuss. Politics was off limits, far too controversial. Religion, unless everyone present shared the same faith, was dangerous territory. Money, of course, was vulgar. Never discuss how much things cost, never mention anyone's financial situation, never reveal the price of your dress or jewellery even if someone asked directly. What could you talk about? The weather was always safe, fashion, as long as you did not seem too invested in it, music and art at a superficial level, travel if you had travelled to the right places in the right way, mutual acquaintances, as long as you said nothing unkind or too revealing. One woman who attended a finishing school in the 1880s wrote in her diary about these conversation lessons. She described feeling like she was being taught a kind of theatre, a performance where she had to play the role of someone fascinating while actually saying nothing of any substance. The goal was to be remembered as charming, without anyone being able to recall a single specific thing you had said. Now, alongside the social skills, there were the accomplishments. This was the term used to describe all the decorative arts that a refined woman should master, and the list was extensive. Music, as we have discussed, was essential, but it was not just about playing an instrument, it was about playing the right kind of music in the right kind of way. Piano pieces should be pleasant, melodic, suitable for background listening, not too complex, not too emotional. You were not performing, you were providing ambience. Singing was taught, but with similar restrictions. Your voice should be sweet, controlled, never too loud or too operatic. You might sing a gentle ballad at a family gathering, but you would never belt out a dramatic aria that might make people stop talking and actually pay attention to you. Drawing and painting, usually watercolours, were part of the curriculum at virtually every finishing school, and there was actually a very specific aesthetic that was encouraged. Gentle landscapes, flowers, perhaps a still life of fruit or books, nothing too dark, too political, too emotionally raw. Art was meant to be decorative, to demonstrate refinement and leisure, not to express deep feelings or challenge the viewer. I find it fascinating that these schools taught so many creative skills while simultaneously constraining them so severely. You were given the tools to be creative, but told exactly what kind of creativity was acceptable. Flower arranging was treated with almost religious seriousness in some schools. There were rules about which flowers could be paired together. Certain combinations were considered vulgar or garish. The arrangement had to look natural but be carefully constructed. It should appear effortless while actually being the result of considerable thought and skill. One finishing school in London actually gave certificates in floral art, as if this were a professional qualification. Young women would spend hours learning about seasonal flowers, colour theory, the symbolic meanings of different blooms. A bouquet of roses meant one thing, lilies another. You could send subtle messages through your flower arrangements if you were skilled enough. And then there was needlework, embroidery, lacework, fine sewing. Now, here is where things get interesting, because unlike some of the other accomplishments, needlework actually had practical value. A woman who could sew well could maintain her own clothes, alter them as fashions changed, even make clothing for her children. This was a genuinely useful skill, but the way it was taught in finishing schools stripped away much of that practicality. The focus was on decorative work, on creating beautiful but essentially useless objects. You might spend weeks embroidering a tiny handkerchief with an intricate monogram, learning stitches so fine they could barely be seen with the naked eye. This demonstrated patience, attention to detail, the ability to sit still for long periods doing delicate work, all qualities that supposedly made you a good prospect for marriage. Some schools did teach more practical sewing skills, particularly the ones aimed at middle-class girls who might not have large staffs of servants in their future homes. But even then, there was always this emphasis on the decorative over the functional. Now, I want to talk about something that might surprise you. Foreign languages were actually a huge part of the finishing school curriculum, and this was one area where the education could be quite rigorous. French was considered absolutely essential. Every refined woman should speak French fluently, not just be able to order food in a restaurant or ask for directions, but actually converse intelligently in French about art, literature, culture. Many finishing schools, particularly those in Switzerland, conducted entire portions of their curriculum in French. Italian was also popular, particularly for girls whose families or wives travelled to Italy regularly, or who might marry into families with Italian connections. German was taught in some schools, though it was considered less elegant than French or Italian. But here is the fascinating contradiction. These young women were becoming genuinely fluent in multiple languages, which is an incredible intellectual achievement. They were reading French literature, sometimes in quite sophisticated ways. They were developing linguistic skills, and yet they were still being told that they should never appear too clever, never show off their knowledge in a way that might intimidate anyone. So you have this absurd situation where a girl might be fluent in 3 languages, but is taught to pretend that it is just a little hobby, nothing serious, nothing that required real intelligence or dedication to achieve. The curriculum also included what we might call practical household management, at least in some schools. You learned how to manage servants, how to plan menus, how to organize a household budget without actually handling the money yourself, because that would be vulgar. You learned the proper way to write invitations, how to plan a dinner party, how to receive guests. Some of the more progressive schools actually taught basic accounting, though it was presented as household management rather than mathematics. You needed to understand numbers well enough to review the household accounts, to know if your servants were being honest, to manage the domestic side of your life efficiently. And here is something that absolutely fascinates me. A few finishing schools, the truly forward-thinking ones, started teaching typing and shorthand in the late 1800s. This was controversial, hugely controversial, because these were commercial skills. They were what shop girls and secretaries learned, not refined young ladies. But some schools recognized that the world was changing. Not every girl would marry wealthy, not every marriage would last. Some women might need to support themselves, and clerical work was far more respectable than many other options available to women at the time. So they quietly added these skills to the curriculum, often presenting them as optional or as something you might use to help with correspondence at home, never admitting that they might be preparing girls for actual employment. The contradiction at the heart of the finishing school curriculum was this: these institutions were supposed to prepare girls for one very specific role, that of an upper-class wife and mother. Everything in the curriculum should have supported that goal. But at the same time, the schools were filled with teachers, many of them unmarried women who had made their own way in the world through education and work. The example of their lives contradicted everything the curriculum was supposedly teaching. And the students, these intelligent young women, they noticed. They saw that their French teacher had never married, but seemed perfectly happy and fulfilled. They saw that their music teacher supported herself through teaching and performing. They saw that education could lead to independence, even if no one was supposed to say so out loud. So the curriculum taught one set of lessons explicitly: how to be decorative, agreeable, accomplished in the right ways. But it taught another set of lessons implicitly, almost accidentally: that women were capable of serious intellectual work, that there were paths in life besides marriage, that having your own skills and knowledge gave you a kind of power even in a world that tried to limit what women could do with that power. This tension, this contradiction, it runs through every aspect of finishing school education, and it is what makes the story so much more complex than it might first appear. These were not just institutions that oppressed women, though they certainly did that. They were also sometimes places where women found unexpected opportunities, made lasting friendships, and discovered capabilities they did not know they had, all within a system designed to constrain them. The human capacity to find freedom even in restriction, to create meaning even in absurdity, it never ceases to amaze me. But we have been talking about English and American finishing schools, about Victorian and Edwardian institutions. There was another world of finishing schools that we have only touched on briefly: Switzerland. The Swiss finishing schools were something else entirely, the crown jewels of the system, where the wealthiest families sent their daughters for the ultimate polish. And the stories from those schools, set in grand villas overlooking alpine lakes, they take this whole story to another level. That is where we're headed next. Snow-capped peaks rising against an impossibly blue sky. The mirror-still surface of Lake Geneva reflecting the morning light. A villa perched on a hillside, its windows overlooking the most breathtaking landscape you can imagine. This is where we find ourselves now, Switzerland. The place where finishing schools reached their absolute pinnacles. If you were a wealthy family in the early 20th century, and you wanted the very best education for your daughter, the kind of polish that money alone could not buy, you sent her to Switzerland. Not to London, not to Paris, but to the Swiss Alps, and there was a very specific reason why. Let me paint you a picture of what made Switzerland so special, so irresistible to these families. Start with the obvious. Switzerland had been neutral for 5 centuries. 500 years without being invaded, without war tearing through its cities and countryside. In the 1920s and 30s, when much of Europe was still recovering from the Great War, when the continent felt unstable and uncertain, Switzerland was an island of peace and safety. But it was more than just political stability. Switzerland offered something that nowhere else could match. It was a linguistic crossroads. Within a few miles you could hear French, German and Italian being spoken as native languages. For a finishing school student, this was invaluable. You could become genuinely multilingual without ever leaving the country. You could practice your French with the shopkeepers in Lausanne, your German with the innkeepers in Zurich, your Italian in the southern cantons. And then there was the landscape itself. The Alps were not just beautiful, they were fashionable. Skiing had become the sport of the aristocracy. European royalty flocked to Swiss resorts every winter. To ski well, to navigate the slopes with grace and confidence, this was a mark of sophistication. So the finishing schools incorporated skiing into their curriculum, not as mere recreation, but as another accomplishment to master. Imagine being 17 years old, standing at the top of a Swiss mountain, the world spread out below you in shades of white and blue and green. For many of these young women, this might have been the freest they ever felt. Moving fast, making their own decisions about which path to take down the mountain, feeling genuinely capable and strong, it must have been intoxicating. But let me tell you about the schools themselves, because they were extraordinary. In the city of Lausanne alone, in the 1920s, there were 45 finishing schools, 45 separate institutions, each occupying its own grand building, each promising to transform your daughter into the perfect young lady. The hillsides around Lake Geneva were dotted with these establishments, their manicured gardens rolling down toward the lake, their salons and dining rooms filled with young women from every corner of the globe. The most prestigious of these schools charged extraordinary fees. We're talking about the equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars today for a single year of education. But for the families who could afford it, no price was too high. Because these schools offered access to a network of other wealthy families, access to potential husbands from the right backgrounds, access to a social world that was otherwise very difficult to enter. Let me tell you about one school in particular because its story captures something essential about this entire world. Château Montchoisy, founded in 1885 in Lausanne. This was one of the very first Swiss finishing schools, and in its early years it was actually quite progressive. It taught not just etiquette and accomplishments, but real academics. It was a pioneer in secondary education for young women at a time when most people thought higher education was wasted on girls. Who attended Château Montchoisy? Let me give you some names, and I think you will begin to understand the calibre of this institution. Carla Bruni-Sarkozy, who would later become First Lady of France, studied there. Princess Eleanor of Romania, the designer Monique Lhuillier, the actress Kitty Carlisle, the Saudi scholar Mai Yamani, the New York socialite Fabiola Beracassa Beckman. These were not just wealthy girls, these were girls who would go on to shape culture, politics, fashion, and society. And they all passed through the same institution, all learned the same lessons about poise and presentation and navigating high society. Château Montchoisy operated for over a century from 1885 until it finally closed in 1995 or 96, depending on which account you believe. When it closed, it marked the end of an era, because by the mid-1990s the whole world of traditional finishing schools was collapsing. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the golden age, the 1950s and 60s, when Swiss finishing schools were at the absolute height of their prestige and influence. This is when Institut Villa Pierrefeu enters our story properly. We have mentioned it before, but now we really need to understand what made this place special. The villa that houses the school was built in 1911 for a Dutch baroness. Can you picture it? A wealthy noblewoman commissioning the construction of her perfect mountain retreat, never imagining that decades later it would become a school for young women from around the world. The founder of the school was a woman named Dorette Feletas, and her story is fascinating. She founded the institution in 1954 and originally called it Bleu Leman, which means Blue Geneva, after the lake. But the name that stuck was Villa Pierrefeu, taking on the name of the villa itself. Now, here is what makes Dorette Feletas so interesting. Her mother was the first female journalist in the French-speaking part of Switzerland. Think about that for a moment. This was a woman who came from a family that believed women could work, could have careers, could make their mark on the world. And yet she founded a finishing school, an institution supposedly designed to prepare girls for marriage and domestic life. But if you look closely at what she created, you see the contradictions we have been talking about throughout this journey. Yes, Villa Pierrefeu taught all the traditional finishing school subjects: etiquette, deportment, flower arranging, formal dining. But Feletas also made sure her students learned practical skills. The curriculum included cooking, not just for show, but real cooking that you could actually use. Home management, understanding how to run a household efficiently. Sewing and childcare. And here is something that was considered absolutely revolutionary at Rostem. Feletas added yoga to the morning routine. Yoga. In the 1950s, This was unheard of in a finishing school, but she believed in it, believed that physical health and mental calm were important. So every morning her students would practice yoga before breakfast. Can you imagine the raised eyebrows, the whispered criticisms from more traditional schools? The school moved to its current location in 1965. Felicitas purchased the actual Villa Pierrefeu, that stunning chalet perched above Montreux with its views of Lake Geneva and the Alps. She had very specific requirements. She wanted a private residence that felt like a home, not an institution. She wanted space for proper classrooms. She wanted a kitchen where students could learn real cooking skills. She wanted a formal dining room for etiquette practice. She wanted sitting rooms where students could relax and socialize. And she wanted bedrooms with private bathrooms, which was quite luxurious for the time. In 1972, Felicitas's daughter, Viviane Neri, took over running the school, and Viviane continued her mother's legacy of slow, careful innovation. The world was changing rapidly in the 70s and 80s. Women's liberation, feminism, the sexual revolution, women flooding into universities and professions. The whole idea of a finishing school seemed increasingly outdated, even ridiculous. Many schools closed during these decades. They could not adapt fast enough. Their enrollments dropped as fewer families saw the value in sending their daughters to learn flower arranging when they could be studying medicine or law or business instead. But Viviane Neri understood something crucial. The core skills that finishing schools taught, the ability to move gracefully in different cultural contexts, to understand etiquette and protocol, to present yourself with confidence. These skills still had value. They just needed to be reframed. So she started making changes. Sewing, which had been a required course since the school's founding, became optional in the 1980s. Not because it was unimportant, but because not every student needed or wanted that particular skill. The focus shifted more toward language learning and cultural understanding. Students still learned French, but now it was paired with serious study of French culture, history, and current events. The student body began to change too. In the early years, most students came from Britain and other parts of Western Europe. They were mostly white, mostly Christian, mostly from aristocratic or upper-class backgrounds. But as the decades passed, the school became more international. Students arrived from Hong Kong, from India, from the Middle East, from Latin America. The curriculum had to adapt to serve this more diverse population. And here is something that I find deeply telling. The tuition kept rising dramatically. In 1990, the cost for a 7.5-month program at Villa Pierrefeu was $33,000. By 2012, just the summer program, which was only 6 weeks long, cost more than $36,000. In 2013, there was an application fee of 600 Swiss francs, which was about 687 American dollars, just to apply. And this was on top of the full tuition. Who could afford this? Only the wealthiest families in the world. But they kept sending their daughters, kept paying these astronomical fees. Why? Because the network alone was worth it. Your daughter would be attending school with the daughters of presidents, diplomats, business magnates, royalty. The connections made at a place like Villa Pierrefeu could last a lifetime and open doors that would otherwise remain closed. Now I want to share with you some of the famous names associated with Swiss finishing schools, because this will help you understand just how influential these institutions were. Princess Diana, perhaps the most famous woman of the late 20th century, attended Institut Alpin Wiedemannet in Rougemont, Switzerland. She was 16 years old, and according to everything we know about her experience, she hated it. She wrote to her nanny, Mary Clark, in December of 1978 saying, "I hated going to the finishing school except for skiing." Think about that for a moment. Here is a girl who will become Princess of Wales, who will be photographed more than any other woman in the world, who will use her platform to bring attention to AIDS patients and landmine victims, and she is miserable at finishing school, except for the skiing, the one part of the curriculum that allowed her to be active, physical, free. Diana begged her parents to let her come home, and after just one term they relented. She left finishing school and returned to London, where she eventually got a job as a kindergarten teacher's assistant. She was earning $5 an hour babysitting and teaching when she met Prince Charles. The finishing school education, as it turned out, was not what prepared her for royal life. Her genuine warmth, her ability to connect with ordinary people, her willingness to break protocol, these were not things you learned in deportment class. Queen Anne-Marie of Greece attended Villa Pierrefeu. So did Princess Irene of Greece and Denmark. These were women born into royalty who were sent to Switzerland to be polished even further, to learn the international etiquette and protocol that would serve them in their official roles. The Maharani of Jaipur, born in 1919, attended Brillant-Mont, another prestigious Swiss finishing school. She later wrote in her memoir about her time there, describing it as a happy period in her life. She wrote letters to her husband-to-be. She pursued skiing and other sports with enthusiasm. For her, the finishing school experience was positive, genuinely enjoyable. This variation in experiences fascinates me. Two women, both from privileged backgrounds, both sent to Swiss finishing schools. One loved it, one hated it. Why the difference? I think it comes down to personality and circumstance. The Maharani of Jaipur was already engaged to be married. Her future was settled. The finishing school was not about finding a husband, but about preparing for a specific role she already knew she would play. There was less pressure, perhaps, less anxiety about the future. Diana, on the other hand, was at finishing school during a difficult time in her life. Her parents had divorced bitterly. She struggled academically, had failed her exams twice, and felt insecure about her intelligence. Being at a school where every gesture was scrutinized, where every mistake was corrected, where she was constantly being evaluated and judged, it must have been excruciating for someone already struggling with self-confidence. The physical setting of these Swiss schools was undeniably beautiful. Villa Pierrefeu, Château Montchoisy, Institut Alpin Vidmenette, Brillant-Mont, all of them occupied spectacular locations with views that would take your breath away. The students would wake up to see mountains and lakes, would take walks through alpine meadows, would ski on world-class slopes. But here is what I keep coming back to. Beauty does not equal happiness. Luxury does not equal fulfillment. You could be living in the most stunning villa in Switzerland, eating gourmet meals, wearing beautiful clothes, and still feel trapped, lonely, desperate to escape. The Swiss finishing schools represented the pinnacle of this world. They had the best locations, the highest fees, the most prestigious student bodies. But they were still, at their core, institutions designed to shape young women into a very specific mould. And not every woman fit that mould, no matter how beautiful the surroundings or how expensive the education. By the 1990s, most of these schools had closed. Institut Alpin Vidmenette, where Diana had been so unhappy, shut its doors in 1991. Château Montchoisy closed in 1995 or 96. Brillant-Mont transformed itself into an international secondary school, no longer operating as a finishing school. Today, only Villa Pierrefeu remains as a traditional finishing school, and even it has had to evolve dramatically to survive. The current director, Viviane Neri, now says something quite telling. She says, "We should not call it a finishing school, but rather a starting school, because we start our students off on a path where learning never ends. A starting school, not a finishing school." The renaming is significant. It acknowledges that education should open doors, not close them. That learning should continue throughout life, not end with marriage. That young women are beginning their journeys, not completing them. But even with this reframing, even with all the adaptations and changes, Villa Pierrefeu stands alone. It is the last remnant of a world that has almost entirely disappeared. The grand villas on the Swiss hillsides now house other businesses, other schools, or have been converted into private residences or hotels. The network of finishing schools that once dotted the landscape around Lake Geneva has vanished like morning mist. What does it mean that only one school survived? Is it a testament to the enduring value of what it teaches? Or is it simply a wealthy curiosity, an anachronism that persists because there will always be some families willing to pay for exclusivity and tradition, regardless of whether the education itself remains relevant? I honestly do not know the answer. Perhaps it is both. But the story of Swiss finishing schools raises a bigger question, one that we have been circling throughout this entire journey. What was the real purpose of all this? The deportment lessons, the flower arranging, the formal dinners, the endless rules about which fork to use and how to sit and when to speak. Was it really about preparing girls for marriage, or was it about something else entirely? About maintaining class boundaries, about controlling women's potential, about creating a marriageable product for the market of wealthy men? That is the darker truth we need to confront. Picture a ball in London, 1860. The grand ballroom of a Mayfair mansion glitters with 1,000 candles reflected in gilt-framed mirrors. Young women in white gowns, their hair elaborately dressed, their posture perfect, stand along the edges of the room. They smile, they flutter their fans just so. They wait. And across from them, young men in tailcoats evaluate them with the same cool calculation you might use when purchasing a horse. Checking teeth, assessing breeding, estimating value. This is what finishing school was really preparing girls for. Not just marriage in the abstract, but the marriage market. A literal marketplace where women were the commodity and their families were the sellers trying to secure the best possible price. Let me be very clear about something. When we talk about the marriage market in Victorian and Edwardian society, we are not using a metaphor. We are describing an actual economic system with rules, strategies, and measurable outcomes. Young women were investments, and finishing school was the final polish before bringing that investment to market. The economics were quite explicit. A family with daughters faced a significant problem. In most cases, those daughters could not inherit property. They could not pursue careers. They were not educated for professions. Their financial security depended entirely on who they married. A good marriage could elevate an entire family's social standing and financial position. A bad marriage, or worse, no marriage at all, could mean poverty and disgrace. So families spent enormous sums, sometimes more than they could truly afford, sending their daughters to finishing schools. Why? Because the return on investment could be spectacular. A girl who married well could secure herself and potentially her younger siblings, a daughter who caught a title, a wealthy merchant, a rising politician. She was worth her weight in gold to her family. The novelist William Makepeace Thackeray captured this perfectly in Vanity Fair, published in 1847 and 1848. The entire novel is about the marriage market, about young women using whatever tools they have to secure their futures. Becky Sharp, the main character, has no money and no family connections, but she is clever and determined, and she understands exactly what game she is playing. She knows that her survival depends on marrying well, and she is willing to do whatever it takes. Thackeray was satirizing the system, yes, but he was also describing it accurately. This was how society worked. Women were commodities with a market value determined by their beauty, their accomplishments, their family connections, and crucially, by the quality of their finishing school education. Now, let me tell you about the London season, because this was where the marriage market operated most explicitly. Every year, from April through August, wealthy families brought their marriageable daughters to London. These young women, usually between 16 and 20 years old, were presented at court to the Queen. This was called coming out, making their debut. It was the official announcement that they were now available for marriage. What followed was an exhausting, expensive, and highly strategic campaign. Balls, dinners, garden parties, opera performances, afternoon teas. Every event was an opportunity to see and be seen, to display your accomplishments, to attract the attention of desirable men and their families. A successful debutante might attend 3 or 4 events every single day during the season. Morning calls, afternoon garden parties, evening balls that lasted until 3 or 4 in the morning, day after day, week after week for months, all while maintaining perfect appearance, perfect manners, perfect charm, never showing fatigue or boredom or any emotion that might be unattractive. The costs were staggering. A family might spend the equivalent of several years of income on a single season. New gowns for every major event, because you could not be seen in the same dress twice. Accommodation in London, which was astronomically expensive. Transportation, servants, entertainment expenses, and then there were the strategic costs. Donations to the right charities, boxes at the opera, subscriptions to the right clubs, all to maintain social position and access to the best events. For families with multiple daughters, this could be financially devastating. You might have to do this several seasons in a row, one daughter after another, each season costing a fortune. Some families quite literally bankrupted themselves trying to marry off their daughters well, and the pressure on the young women themselves was immense. Imagine knowing that your entire future, your security, your comfort, perhaps even your survival, depends on charming some man you have barely met into proposing marriage to you. And you have perhaps 4 months to accomplish this, competing against dozens or even hundreds of other young women who've been trained in exactly the same skills you have. You must be pretty, but not too pretty, because men might find that intimidating. Accomplished, but not too accomplished, because you must not overshadow the man. Interesting, but not too interesting, because strong opinions are unfeminine. Charming, but not too charming, because that might seem manipulative. You must hit this incredibly narrow target while exhausted, probably hungry because ladies eat very little, wearing painfully tight corsets and shoes that hurt your feet, smiling constantly even when you feel like crying. Can you imagine the anxiety, the fear of failure, the desperation some of these young women must have felt? And here is something that makes it even worse. There was a ticking clock. A woman who did not marry during her first season might get a second chance the following year. But after that, after 2 or 3 unsuccessful seasons, you started to be seen as past your prime, as unwanted goods. The whispers would start. Why has no one proposed to her? What is wrong with her? There was even a term for it. A woman who had multiple unsuccessful seasons became known as a wallflower, or more cruelly, as being on the shelf, as if she were a product in a shop that no one wanted to purchase. By her mid-20s, if she was still unmarried, many people would consider her a spinster. Her chances of a good marriage had passed. She might have to settle for a much less desirable match, or face the reality of remaining unmarried, dependent on her family's charity or forced to become a governess or companion. The fear of becoming a spinster was used deliberately to pressure young women. It was a threat, a warning. Marry well while you can, or face a life of poverty and social irrelevance. Finishing schools understood this pressure perfectly, and they exploited it. They promised families that they could increase their daughter's market value, that they could turn a merely presentable girl into an irresistible one, that their education would give these young women an edge in the brutal competition of the marriage market. And to be fair, finishing schools did provide real advantages in this marketplace. A girl who could speak French fluently, who could play piano beautifully, who knew exactly which fork to use and how to carry herself with grace, she did have an advantage over a girl who lacked these skills. Not because these skills made her a better person or a more capable one, but because they signalled class, breeding, and proper training. They proved to potential suitors and their families that she would be an asset rather than an embarrassment. The marriage negotiations themselves were often quite cold-blooded. Families would investigate potential matches carefully. What were the young man's prospects? Would he inherit property? What were his debts, his habits, his character? And the young man's family would investigate the girl just as carefully. What was her dowry? What property or connections did her family have? Was her health good? Her temperament suitable? Love, if it happened at all, was considered a pleasant bonus, not a requirement. The primary considerations were financial and social. Would this marriage improve both families' positions? Could they bear to be in the same room together for the rest of their lives? That was often good enough. Some marriages made through this system were happy, certainly. People can learn to care for each other, and many couples develop genuine affection over time, but many marriages were miserable. Women trapped with men who ignored them, abused them, or simply made them unhappy. Men tied to women they found boring or irritating, but once you were married there was no escape. Divorce was almost impossible for most of the 19th century, and even when laws began to change, divorce carried such social stigma that it destroyed a woman's reputation completely. So women endured. They made the best of situations that ranged from tolerable to terrible, because they had no other choice. And here is the really dark part. Finishing schools knew all of this. The teachers and administrators understood perfectly that they were preparing girls for a marriage market where the girls themselves had very little power, where their value was determined by superficial accomplishments and physical appearance, where their entire futures depended on attracting men who held all the economic and social power. And yet they never talked about this openly. They never said, we are teaching you these skills so you can compete effectively in a brutal marketplace where you are the commodity. Instead, they used softer language. They talked about refinement and accomplishment and becoming a lady. They made it sound like this education was about personal development, about becoming your best self. But the girls understood. How could they not? They could see what was happening. They knew that everything they were learning was designed to make them more marriageable, that their worth was being measured by their ability to attract and please men, that failure meant poverty and social death. This knowledge created a terrible tension. On one hand, you had to play the game. Your survival might depend on it. On the other hand, playing the game meant accepting your own commodification. It meant agreeing that your value as a human being could be reduced to your accomplishments and appearance, that your hopes and dreams and capabilities mattered less than whether you could curtsy beautifully and arrange flowers. Some young women navigated this with strategic clarity. They saw the marriage market for what it was and played it skillfully, using the tools they'd been given to secure good matches. Others internalized the values, coming to believe that their worth really did depend on being pleasing and accomplished. Still others chafed against the whole system, feeling trapped and angry and desperate for alternatives that barely existed. And what about the young women who simply did not want to marry, who looked at the marriages they saw around them and thought, I would rather be poor and free than rich and trapped? These women had very few options. They could try to remain unmarried and dependent on their family's charity. They could become governesses or companions, living in other people's homes, neither family nor servant, occupying an uncomfortable middle ground. Or they could marry anyway, suppressing their own desires and hopes because the alternatives were so bleak. The marriage market also revealed the deep class divisions in society. Finishing schools were for wealthy or at least comfortable families. Working class girls had no access to this system. They might work as servants or in factories, and they might marry, but their marriages were not negotiations between wealthy families. They were not part of the marriage market we are discussing. This created a strange situation where upper class women had less freedom in some ways than working class women. A working-class woman might choose her own husband based on affection or practical partnership. She might delay marriage to work and earn money. She had fewer options in life overall, certainly, but in the specific matter of marriage, she often had more personal choice than her wealthier counterparts. Upper-class women were more constrained, their marriages more strategic, their lives more carefully controlled. They had more material comfort but less personal autonomy. The gilded cage was still a cage, and the men in this system? They had far more freedom, but they were not entirely free either. They too faced pressure to marry appropriately, to choose brides who would enhance rather than diminish their social standing. But their choices mattered differently. A man could delay marriage, could marry somewhat later in life, could even choose not to marry without facing the same social and economic consequences a woman would face. The power imbalance was enormous. Now, I want to return to finishing schools themselves, because understanding the marriage market helps us understand what these institutions really were. They were not schools in the sense we usually mean. They were not primarily about education or personal development or intellectual growth. They were training camps for the marriage market. They were institutions designed to increase young women's commodity value by teaching them the skills and behaviors that made them more desirable to wealthy men. Every lesson, every rule, every correction, it all served this purpose. Walk with books on your head, not because good posture is inherently valuable, but because graceful movement makes you more attractive. Learn which fork to use not because etiquette matters morally, but because using the wrong fork will embarrass your husband and lower your value. Speak French not because language learning expands your mind, but because it signals cultivation and breeding. The education was instrumental, designed to achieve a specific outcome, and that outcome was not the woman's own flourishing or happiness. It was her successful placement in a marriage that benefited her family. This is what makes finishing school so troubling from a modern perspective. They took young women at a vulnerable age, subjected them to rigid control and often harsh treatment, all while preparing them to accept their own commodification. They taught girls that their worth was external, tied to performance and appearance and male approval, that their dreams and desires mattered less than their duties and their market value. But here is what I keep coming back to. Knowing all of this, understanding how brutal and dehumanizing the system was, what were individual families and individual young women supposed to do? In a world where women could not own property, could not pursue careers, could not support themselves, what alternative did they have? The system was wrong, deeply wrong, but refusing to participate in it could mean poverty and suffering for yourself and your family. So people participated, even knowing the cost because the alternative seemed worse. However, not everyone accepted this. Not every young woman went quietly into the marriage market. Some pushed back, some rebelled, some found ways to resist even within a system designed to eliminate resistance. And those acts of rebellion, both large and small, they tell us something important about the human capacity to resist even when resistance seems futile. They called her Charlotte, and she was 17 years old when she arrived at a finishing school in Bath, one of the most fashionable spa towns in England. It was 1827, and by all accounts, Charlotte was exactly the kind of student the school wanted. Her family was respectable, well-connected. She had been taught at home by governesses. She knew how to curtsy properly, how to play the piano adequately. On paper, she was perfect finishing school material. 6 months later, Charlotte ran away with an army officer. Not the officer her parents had intended for her to marry, but a different one entirely. She eloped in the middle of the night, leaving behind nothing but a brief note and a scandal that rocked the entire school. Now you might be thinking, well, that is just one rebellious girl, one isolated incident. But here is the thing. Stories like Charlotte's were far more common than anyone wanted to admit. Because you can create all the rules you want, you can monitor and control and restrict young women as much as you like, but you cannot actually eliminate human nature. You cannot stop people from wanting what they want, from feeling what they feel, from pushing back against constraints that feel unbearable. The rebellion in finishing schools took many forms. Some of it was dramatic, like Charlotte's midnight elopement, but most of it was quieter, smaller, the kind of resistance that could be hidden or explained away. And tonight, I want to tell you about those rebellions, because they reveal something essential about the young women who lived through this system. Let me start with something that might surprise you. Books. The reading of unauthorized books was one of the most common forms of rebellion in finishing schools, and it was taken very seriously by the authorities. Most schools had strict rules about what students were allowed to read. The Bible, of course, was always permitted. Educational texts approved by the teachers were fine. Perhaps some poetry carefully selected to be morally uplifting and not too passionate. But novels, especially romantic novels, were often forbidden or heavily restricted. Why? Because the schools worried that reading about passionate love, about women making their own choices, about lives beyond the domestic sphere, would give girls dangerous ideas, would make them dissatisfied with the role they were being prepared to fill. But of course, forbidding something only makes it more desirable, especially to intelligent young women who are starved for intellectual stimulation. So novels were smuggled in. Girls would hide them under their mattresses, in the bottoms of their trunks, inside the covers of approved books. They would pass them from hand to hand, reading by candlelight after everyone was supposed to be asleep. There are accounts from multiple finishing schools of teachers conducting surprise inspections, searching through students' belongings looking for contraband books. When they found them, the punishments could be severe. The book would be confiscated and burned, yes, actually burned. The student might be denied meals, confined to her room, or even sent home in disgrace. One former student of a London finishing school wrote in her diary about a particularly treasured copy of a novel by Sir Walter Scott that made its way around the entire dormitory over the course of several months. Each girl would read a portion, then hide it again, then pass it along to the next reader. The book was finally discovered by a teacher during a room inspection, and the girl in whose possession it was found was given such a harsh punishment that the others pooled their pocket money to try to make it up to her. Think about what this tells us. These young women were creating an underground library, a secret network of shared reading. They were taking risks, protecting each other, finding ways to access the ideas and stories they craved, even when they were explicitly forbidden. Then there was the matter of correspondence. Letters from home were theoretically private, but in many schools teachers reserved the right to read them before delivering them to students. And letters going out, written by students to their families, were often read as well to make sure nothing inappropriate was being said. This created an obvious problem. How do you write honestly to your parents about how unhappy you are if you know your letter will be intercepted? How do you tell them about a harsh teacher, an unjust punishment, a problem you are having if the very people you're complaining about will read your words? Some girls developed codes, simple ones that their families could understand but that might slip past a casual reading by a teacher. I am studying very hard might mean I am being treated unfairly but cannot say so directly. The weather here is quite cold could mean I'm unhappy and want to come home. My roommate is very kind might mean I trust this person, or conversely, if they had agreed on it beforehand, it might mean quite the opposite. Others found ways to smuggle out uncensored letters. A sympathetic servant might be convinced to post a letter in town without showing it to the teachers first. A visiting family member might be slipped a letter during a brief moment when no one was watching closely. The need to communicate honestly, to be heard and understood, it was your... These young women found ways around every restriction. Now, let me tell you about the rebellion that absolutely scandalized Victorian society when it came to light. There was a novel written by Charles Dickens in which he described a fictional finishing school called Minerva House, and the story he told hit uncomfortably close to truth. In the story, a member of parliament sends his daughter to Minerva House specifically to keep her away from a young man he considers an unsuitable match. He thinks that by secluding her in a finishing school, by surrounding her with rules and chaperones, he can prevent the romance from developing. But of course, it has exactly the opposite effect. The girl manages to communicate with her suitor, they plan an elopement, and they run away together, leaving the father furious and the school's reputation in tatters. Dickens, being Dickens, used this story to poke fun at finishing schools in general. He, as the Member of Parliament, declared that he will bring in a bill for the abolition of finishing schools, suggesting that they do more harm than good. Now, this was fiction, satire even, but everyone who read it knew that it was based on real incidents that had actually occurred. Elopements from finishing schools were scandalous enough that they made their way into popular culture. The schools tried to prevent them, of course. They had strict rules about contact with young men. Students were chaperoned whenever they left the school grounds. Letters from male correspondents were carefully monitored. But love, or at least infatuation, has a way of finding a path. A young woman might meet someone during a carefully chaperoned outing to the theatre or a concert. They might exchange glances across a ballroom during a dancing lesson. A letter might be passed through a sympathetic servant or an obliging friend. The novelist Thomas Hamilton, writing in 1827, described finishing school students in the harshest possible terms. He called them, and I am quoting here, always pert, forward, ill-educated and ill-bred. Now, Hamilton had an agenda. He was critical of the entire system of women's education as it existed at the time, but his description stuck because it captured something that made society uncomfortable. The finishing schools were supposed to produce modest, demure, obedient young women, but what they actually often produced were young women who knew how to appear modest while harbouring their own thoughts and feelings, who had learned to navigate complex social rules and could therefore also navigate around those rules when it suited them, who had been given just enough education to be frustrated by the limitations placed on their lives. Hamilton tells a story in his novel about a young woman who has just returned from a finishing school in Bath. She is introduced to an army officer at a social gathering, and before anyone quite realises what is happening, she is run off with him. Her reputation is ruined, her family is scandalised, and the finishing school's name is dragged through the mud. Again, this is fiction, but it is fiction that people recognised. These stories circulated because they happened often enough to be believable. Now, not all rebellion was about romance or elopement. Much of it was smaller, more mundane, but no less significant for the young women involved. There was the rebellion of the body. Remember, these schools required perfect posture at all times. Back straight, shoulders back, chin level, no slouching ever, but maintaining that posture for 16 or 17 hours a day is exhausting. So girls would sneak moments of relaxation, slouching when they thought no one was watching, lying down on their beds during free periods even though this was forbidden, kicking off their tight shoes under the dining table and flexing their aching feet. These tiny physical rebellions, they were about reclaiming ownership of your own body, about refusing to be a display piece every single moment of every single day. There was the rebellion of appetite. The formal meals with their tiny portions and elaborate rules left many girls genuinely hungry. Growing teenagers need food, lots of it, but ladies were not supposed to have hearty appetites, so girls would hoard food. Sneaking bread rolls from dinner to eat later in their rooms, hiding biscuits in their trunks, pooling their pocket money to buy sweets from vendors in town when they had the chance. One account describes a group of girls at a Swiss finishing school who regularly conducted midnight raids on the kitchen. They would wait until the entire staff was asleep, then creep downstairs to steal cheese, bread, fruit, whatever they could find. They called themselves the Midnight Society, and they maintained their secret operation for nearly a year before they were finally caught. The punishment was severe, But years later, the women who'd been part of the Midnight Society remembered it with a kind of pride. They had broken the rules together, had taken care of each other, had refused to go hungry just because it was considered unladylike to eat adequately. Then there was the rebellion of mockery. Oh, the nicknames students came up with for their stricter teachers. These were rarely kind, often quite cruel, but they served an important purpose. They allowed the students to reclaim some power in a situation where they had very little. A particularly stern deportment teacher might be called the general or the sergeant. A teacher obsessed with perfect table manners might be the fork inspector. One headmistress known for her glacial demeanour was apparently nicknamed the Ice Queen by multiple generations of students. These nicknames were whispered in dormitories after lights out. They were the subject of secret jokes and mock impersonations when no adults were around. They were never said to the teachers' faces, of course, but they circulated through the student body, creating a sense of shared understanding, of solidarity against the authorities. In some schools, particularly the more progressive ones, there were teachers who quietly encouraged a spirit of independence even while officially enforcing all the rules. Frances Arabella Rowden at Reading Abbey, who we have mentioned before, was apparently quite good at walking this line. She pushed her students to think critically, to write poetry that expressed genuine emotion, to develop their own voices. But she did it subtly enough that the school administration never quite realised how subversive she was being. One of her former students wrote years later about how Miss Rowden would assign poetry that was technically appropriate, but that had layers of meaning if you knew how to read them. How she would lead discussions of literature that were officially about style and technique, but that actually grappled with big questions about women's roles, about freedom, about what makes a life meaningful. This kind of teaching, this quiet subversion from within, it must have been incredibly valuable to students who were hungry for more than they were officially being given. Now, I want to be clear about something. Not all students rebelled. Many genuinely embraced the system, believed in what they were being taught, and followed the rules without question. Some because they truly felt it was right, others because they were afraid of the consequences of disobedience, still others because they had internalized the message that their worth depended on being perfectly obedient and accomplished. And we should not romanticize rebellion for its own sake. Some of the young women who eloped, who ran away, who defied their families and their schools, they ended up in genuinely difficult situations. Marriages that turned abusive, poverty after being cut off by their families, social ostracism that made their lives very hard. But what strikes me, what I keep coming back to, is the sheer determination of so many of these young women to maintain some sense of themselves as individuals with their own desires and dreams and ideas. Even within a system designed to mould them into identical products for the marriage market, they found ways to be distinct, to be human, to be more than what they were supposed to be. The schools had all the institutional power. They could make rules, enforce punishments, control almost every aspect of daily life. But they could not control what happened in the students' minds. They could not stop the friendships that formed, the ideas that were shared in whispered conversations, the books that circulated in secret, the dreams that persisted despite all efforts to constrain them. There is something deeply moving about this to me. The human spirit's refusal to be entirely shaped by external forces, the persistence of individuality even under enormous pressure to conform. Every time a girl hid a novel under her mattress, every time students pooled resources to help one of their own who'd been punished unfairly, every time someone risked consequences to write an honest letter home, every time they mocked the very rules that constrained them, they were asserting their humanity. They were saying in small but significant ways, I am more than you're trying to make me. And here is what I find most interesting. The schools never quite figured out how to stop this. They could punish individual acts of rebellion, but they could not eliminate the impulse to rebel, because that impulse came from something fundamental, from the gap between what these young women were capable of and what they were allowed to be. The more the schools tried to restrict and control, the more creative the resistance became. It was an unwinnable battle, though it took decades for the schools to fully realize this. But before we can understand why the finishing school system finally collapsed, we need to understand something darker. The real cost of all this control and restriction, not just the small rebellions, but the genuine harm that was done to some students, the abuse, the neglect, the psychological damage that the system enabled, that is difficult territory, but it is where we must go next. Sometimes the silence in a room can be more frightening than any sound, and there was one particular kind of silence in finishing school that haunts me when I read about it in old letters and diaries. The silence of a young girl sitting at an empty dinner table, watching the other students eat, her own stomach aching with hunger, while the teachers pretended she was not even there. This was a real punishment used at multiple schools across England and Europe. If you made a mistake in your lessons, if you forgot a date in history or conjugated a French verb incorrectly, if you slouched or spoke too loudly or showed any sign of being less than perfect, you might be denied your evening meal. Not just once, but repeatedly, sometimes for weeks at a time. Let that sink in for a moment. A teenage girl still growing, her body needing nutrition, sitting alone while her classmates eat, being punished with hunger for academic mistakes or minor infractions of deportment. And this was considered acceptable. This was considered educational. I need to tell you about this part of the story, even though it is painful, because we cannot understand finishing schools fully without confronting the real harm that some of them caused. Not the quirky rules or the absurd lessons, but the genuine cruelty that was sometimes inflicted on vulnerable young women in the name of refinement and education. Let me start with something that appeared in multiple accounts from different schools across different decades. The governess who took her anger out on her students. These were not all the governesses, of course. Many were kind, patient women who genuinely cared about their charges. But some were bitter, frustrated by their own limited options in life, and they wielded what little power they had with cruelty. There is an account from a girl who attended a private finishing school in the 1860s. She describes a governess who would pinch students hard enough to leave bruises if they made mistakes, who would slap their hands with a wooden ruler for holding a book incorrectly, who would make them stand in corners for hours, sometimes missing meals, as punishment for infractions that seem incredibly minor from our perspective today. But here is what makes this even more disturbing. When the girl finally worked up the courage to tell her parents during a visit home, showing them the bruises on her arms, they told her not to complain. They said she should be grateful for the opportunity to attend such a good school. They told her to endure, to learn her lessons, to stop being difficult. Can you imagine? Your child comes to you with evidence of physical abuse, and your response is to tell her to be quiet and accept it. But this was not unusual. Many parents believed that strict discipline was necessary to shape their daughters properly, and they trusted the schools absolutely, believing that any punishment must have been deserved. The psychological impact of this must have been devastating. You are being hurt, and the people who are supposed to protect you tell you that you deserve it, that you are the problem. How do you recover from that? How does it shape the way you see yourself and the world? Now, let me tell you about dame schools, because this takes us even deeper into the dysfunction of girls' education in the 19th century. Dame schools were supposedly schools for young children, often run by local women, usually widows or spinsters who needed income. They were common throughout England and were often the only educational option for children from working-class families. The theory was that these women would teach basic reading, writing and arithmetic to young children, but here is the reality. Many dame schools were run by women who were themselves illiterate, not just poorly educated but actually unable to read or write. So what exactly were they teaching? Essentially, they were running daycare operations. They kept children safe while their parents worked, which was valuable, certainly. But calling them schools was generous at best, fraudulent at worst. And yet poor families paid what little money they had to send their children to these places, believing they were getting an education. For girls in particular, dame schools often taught nothing beyond the very basics of reading and some needlework. The assumption was that working-class girls would go into domestic service, so why would they need more education than that? It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. Give girls minimal education because you assume they will only be servants, and then, lacking education, they have no choice but to become servants. Even the better dame schools, the ones run by literate women who genuinely tried to teach, faced enormous challenges. Classes might have 30 or 40 children of wildly different ages and abilities all in one room. Resources were scarce. Teachers were exhausted and underpaid. Learning happened mostly by rote memorization, children chanting their lessons over and over, till the words were burned into their minds even if they had no understanding of what the words meant. One historian described dame schools as travesties of schools, incapable of teaching children anything useful. That might be harsh for the best ones, but for many it was accurate. And yet these were the only educational opportunities available to vast numbers of girls. Contrast this with the finishing schools for wealthy girls. They had beautiful facilities, accomplished teachers, extensive resources. But they used all those advantages to teach flower arranging and which fork to use for fish. Meanwhile, poor girls sat in cramped rooms with illiterate teachers, getting almost no real education at all. The class divide in women's education was staggering. But let me bring us back to the finishing schools themselves, because there is more we need to understand about the harm they could cause, even expensive ones with qualified teachers. Loneliness. Profound, aching loneliness. This comes up again and again in letters and diaries from finishing school students. Being sent away from home, sometimes to another country, at age 15 or 16 or 17. Being surrounded by strangers, living by rigid rules, having every moment of your day controlled by others. Even with roommates and classmates around you constantly, you could feel utterly alone. Some girls wrote letters home begging to be allowed to return, not because they were being physically abused or denied food, but simply because they were so homesick, so desperately unhappy, that they felt they could not bear another day. And often those letters were either intercepted by teachers or dismissed by parents who believed that the girls just needed to adjust, to toughen up, to stop being so emotional. Princess Diana's experience at Institut Alpen Widmanet fits this pattern. She was only at the school for one term, and by all accounts she was miserable the entire time, except for the skiing lessons. She wrote to her nanny saying she hated it. She begged to come home, and eventually her parents relented. But how many other girls in similar situations were not so fortunate? How many were forced to stay despite their unhappiness? There is something particularly cruel about being unhappy and being told that you have no right to be unhappy because you're so privileged. Yes, you are at an expensive school. Yes, your family has paid a great deal of money for this opportunity, but that does not erase the genuine emotional pain of isolation and homesickness. Privilege does not protect you from loneliness or despair. And then there is the issue of mental health, which was barely acknowledged at all during most of the finishing school era. If a girl showed signs of depression, anxiety, or any other psychological distress, it was often dismissed as attention-seeking, or being overly emotional or having a weak character. There was no understanding of mental illness as something real and treatable. There was no therapy, no counselling, no support systems. If you were struggling, you were essentially on your own. You might confide in a friend, if you were lucky enough to have made a close friend. But otherwise you suffered in silence, trying desperately to maintain the appearance of being fine because showing vulnerability was seen as a failure. We know now from modern psychology that adolescence and young adulthood are critical periods for mental health. The teenage years are when many mental health conditions first emerge. and we know that isolation, rigid control, lack of autonomy, and constant criticism can all contribute to or worsen mental health problems. How many young women at finishing schools were dealing with undiagnosed and untreated depression, anxiety disorders, eating disorders, trauma responses? We will never know the full extent because these conditions were not recognized or recorded, but we can read between the lines of old letters and diaries and see the signs. A girl who writes about feeling numb, unable to enjoy anything. A girl who mentions that she has stopped eating much because she has no appetite and everything tastes like ash. A girl who describes lying awake most of the night, her mind racing with worries. These are classic symptoms of mental health conditions, but at the time they were just seen as personal failings. And eating disorders, oh, this is an area where finishing schools caused very specific harm. Remember, these institutions were teaching girls that being decorative was their primary value, that they needed to be attractive to potential husbands, that their appearance was more important than their health or happiness or any other consideration. At the same time, they were restricting food both deliberately through punishments and indirectly through the emphasis on small ladylike portions. They were creating an environment where food became loaded with moral and social significance, where eating heartily was considered vulgar and unfeminine, where hunger was something to be ignored or suppressed. This is a perfect recipe for disordered eating patterns, and while we do not have detailed statistics on eating disorders among finishing school students, because the concept of eating disorders was not really understood at the time, we have enough anecdotal evidence to know it was a problem. Girls comparing their bodies to each other, feeling inadequate if they were not as thin as their classmates. Girls secretly eating and then feeling guilty about it. Girls taking pride in how little they could eat, seeing it as a sign of refinement and self-control. These are all warning signs of disordered eating, and they were built into the finishing school culture. Princess Diana herself struggled with bulimia, an eating disorder that began during her time as a young woman and continued through much of her adult life. Now, I'm not saying that finishing school caused her eating disorder. The causes of such conditions are always complex and multifaceted. But the culture of those institutions, the emphasis on appearance, the control over food, the pressure to be perfect, these things certainly did not help. They likely made vulnerable girls more vulnerable. Let me tell you about another form of harm that is harder to quantify but no less real. The crushing of ambition and curiosity. Imagine being a naturally curious, intellectually gifted young woman. You love learning, you ask questions, you want to understand how things work. You are interested in mathematics, or science, or philosophy, or politics, and then you are sent to an institution that tells you, explicitly or implicitly, that these interests are inappropriate for a woman, that you should focus on accomplishments, not academics, that being too clever will make you unmarriageable, that your job is not to think deeply but to be pleasing. What does that do to a person? How do you reconcile your natural inclinations with what you're being told about who you're supposed to be? Some girls found ways to pursue their interests secretly, as we discussed with the smuggled books, but others internalized the message. They learned to suppress their curiosity, to hide their intelligence, to make themselves smaller intellectually so they would fit the mold they were supposed to fill. Frances Power Cobb, who attended an expensive boarding school for girls in the mid-19th century, later wrote about her experience. She said that whatever they were taught was de-emphasized in its importance. The message was clear. Your education does not really matter. You're here for other reasons. Learning is just something to pass the time until you get married. Can you imagine how frustrating that must have been for a bright, engaged student? To be given access to knowledge but told constantly that it was not really valuable, not really important, not really appropriate for you. Mary Somerville, who we mentioned briefly before, became a renowned astronomer and mathematician despite her limited formal education. She taught herself advanced mathematics and science, and her work was highly respected by male scientists of her era. But when she looked back on her schooling, all she could remember was being made to memorize pages of Dr. Johnson's dictionary with no context or application. Rote learning with no purpose, no meaning, no connection to genuine understanding. How many other young women had the potential to be brilliant scientists, mathematicians, writers, thinkers, but never got the chance to develop those talents because they were told it was not ladylike to have such ambitions? This is a form of harm that is difficult to measure, but it is harm nonetheless, the deliberate limitation of human potential, the systematic discouragement of curiosity and ambition in half the population. Now, I want to be clear about something important. Not every finishing school was abusive, not every teacher was cruel, not every student was harmed. Many women genuinely enjoyed their time at finishing schools and felt they benefited from the experience. Many formed lifelong friendships and learned skills that served them well. But the potential for harm was built into the system. When you create institutions designed to control and shape young women according to a very narrow definition of femininity, when you give those institutions enormous power over vulnerable people with minimal oversight, when you tell parents not to believe their daughters if they complain, you create conditions where abuse can flourish. And even in schools where there was no overt cruelty, there was still the fundamental harm of the system itself, the message that you are not quite good enough as you are, that you need to be finished, polished, perfected, that your natural self is somehow inadequate and must be suppressed or reshaped. Think about spending your formative years in an environment that is constantly telling you, directly or indirectly, that who you are is not acceptable, that you need to be different, better, more controlled, more decorative, more pleasing to others. What does that do to your sense of self-worth, to your confidence, to your understanding of your own value as a human being? The psychological legacy of finishing schools likely extended far beyond the years that women actually spent in them. How you were taught to see yourself as an adolescent shapes how you see yourself as an adult. If you spent your teenage years learning that your worth was tied to your appearance and accomplishments rather than to your intrinsic value as a person, that is a lesson that can be very difficult to unlearn. So when we talk about the dark side of finishing schools, we are not just talking about the cases of overt abuse, the cruel punishments, the food deprivation, the psychological manipulation. We are also talking about something more subtle but equally damaging, the systematic shaping of young women to fit a mold that was far too small for the fullness of human potential and possibility. But here is something remarkable. Despite all of this harm, despite the cruelty and the limitations and the damage, some women emerged from finishing schools with their spirits intact. Some even used their experiences there as fuel for change, for pushing back against the very system that had tried to constrain them. And that resilience, that refusal to be entirely shaped by forces that sought to diminish them, that is what we need to explore next. Her name was Emma Roberts, and she graduated from Reading Abbey Girls' School in the early 1800s. Most people today have never heard of her, but in her time she was famous. Not as someone's wife, not as a society hostess, but as a travel writer. She journeyed to India, wrote extensively about what she saw, and published books that were widely read across England. She did this at a time when respectable women were not supposed to travel alone, were not supposed to write for publication, were not supposed to have careers at all. And she started at a finishing school. This is the paradox we need to explore now. We have talked about the harm these institutions could cause, the ways they tried to limit and constrain young women. But we also need to acknowledge something remarkable. Some women emerged from finishing schools and went on to do extraordinary things. They took the education they received, even the limited and contradictory education it was, and they used it as a foundation for lives that defied every expectation. So let me tell you about some of these women, because their stories reveal something important about human resilience and the unpredictable ways that education can shape a life. Let us start with Jane Austen, because her story connects directly to what we have been discussing. Jane and her sister Cassandra attended Reading Abbey Girls' School in 1785 and 1786. They were there for only about a year, maybe a bit longer, depending on which historical account you believe. Their father, George Austen, was a country rector of modest means. Sending both daughters to an expensive boarding school was a significant financial sacrifice for the family. What did Jane learn there? We do not have detailed records, but we know the school offered French, Italian, music, dancing and needlework, along with more academic subjects like history and literature. The school had that remarkable teacher, Frances Arabella Rowden, who encouraged her students to write poetry and develop their own voices. Now, did finishing school make Jane Austen into the brilliant novelist she became? Of course not. Her genius was her own. But here is what is interesting. Austen's novels are full of observations about the education of young women. She understood intimately the world of accomplishments and etiquette and the marriage market, and she wrote about it with a sharp satirical eye. Think about the Bennet sisters in Pride and Prejudice. Mary, who shows off her piano playing even though she is not particularly talented, because she has been taught that accomplishments are what matter. Lydia, who has learned all the superficial graces but has no judgment or moral sense. Elizabeth, who is intelligent and well-read, but considered unusual because she actually thinks for herself. Austen was writing about the world she knew, the world of finishing schools and young women being prepared for the marriage market. And she was critiquing it, gently but unmistakably. She was saying, look at what this system produces. Look at the absurdities and contradictions. So in a way, Austen took her finishing school education and turned it into art, into literature that has endured for more than 2 centuries. Not bad for someone who was only supposed to learn how to be a decorative wife. Then there is Anna Maria Hall, another alumna of Reading Abbey Girls' School. She became a successful novelist and playwright. Her husband was also a writer, and together they were prominent figures in London literary society. She wrote about Ireland, about social issues, about the lives of women. She used her voice, her education, her ability to write well to make a mark on the world. And Letitia Elizabeth Landon, we have mentioned her before, but her story deserves more attention. She was educated by Frances Rowden at Reading Abbey, and she became one of the most famous poets of the early 19th century. Her work was published widely. She earned her living through her writing, and she was admired by readers across Britain. Her life was not easy. She faced criticism for being too bold, too public, too unconventional for a woman, but she persisted. She wrote, she published, she made a career in literature at a time when women writers were often dismissed or mocked. All 3 of these women, Austen, Hall and Landon, attended the same finishing school. They were shaped by the same teachers, exposed to the same curriculum. And all 3 became writers, women who used words to make their mark on the world. Coincidence? I do not think so. Something about that particular school, probably the influence of Frances Rowden, encouraged intellectual ambition in ways that most finishing schools did not. Now let me take you to a different kind of a G. The actress Jean Tierney, one of the great Hollywood stars of the 1940s, attended Brillantement Finishing School in Switzerland. She was there in the 1930s, during the school's heyday. She later said she spoke only French while at school and spent her holidays travelling to Norway and England with fellow students. What did finishing school give Jean Tierney? Certainly not acting skills, that was not part of the curriculum, but it gave her poise, confidence, the ability to move gracefully in high society. It gave her fluency in French, which served her well in her international career. It gave her an air of sophistication that became part of her screen persona. When you watch Jean Tierney in films like Laura or Leave Her to Heaven, You are seeing someone who carries herself with absolute assurance. Part of that was her natural talent, certainly, but part of it was also the training she received at Brillantement. The hundreds of hours of deportment lessons, the practice at formal dinners, the emphasis on grace and presentation. She took those skills and brought them to the screen. And then there is the Maharani of Jaipur, Gayatri Devi, born in 1919 into Indian royalty. She attended Brillantement in the late 1930s. She wrote in her memoir about how happy she was there, how she loved the skiing and the sports, how she wrote letters to her husband-to-be and felt excited about her future. But here is what makes her story particularly interesting. After her marriage, the Maharani became a political figure. She was elected to the Indian Parliament multiple times. She worked on education reform, particularly for girls. She used her position and influence to push for greater opportunities for women in India. Did finishing school prepare her for political life? Not directly, obviously, but it gave her confidence, exposure to international perspectives, and experience navigating complex social situations. She took what she learned about etiquette and protocol and applied it to diplomacy and politics. She took the poise and presentation skills and used them to be effective in public life. The Maharani could have simply been a decorative royal wife, which is what finishing school was supposedly preparing her to be. Instead, she became a force for change, and she did it while maintaining the grace and dignity that her finishing school education had emphasized. Let me tell you about someone whose story takes us in a completely different direction. Beatrice Potter Webb, born in 1858, was educated at home and at various private schools, including ones with finishing school elements. She came from a wealthy family and was expected to marry well and manage a great household. Instead, she became a socialist, a political economist, and a social reformer. She and her husband, Sidney Webb, were founders of the London School of Economics. She wrote extensively about poverty, labour conditions, and this need for social welfare programmes. She was a key figure in the development of the British Labour Party. Nothing about her upper-class education prepared her for this. In fact, everything about it was designed to prevent exactly this kind of political engagement. But somewhere along the way, the education she received gave her the tools to think critically, to analyse complex systems, to write persuasively, and she turned those tools towards social justice. I love this about human beings, by the way. You can try to shape them for one purpose, give them an education designed to produce one kind of person, and they will take that education and use it in completely unexpected ways. You cannot control what people do with the knowledge and skills you give them, even if you give those things grudgingly or with strings attached. Now let us talk about royalty, because finishing schools were filled with princesses and future queens, and some of them used their education in fascinating ways. Queen Anne-Marie of Greece, who attended Institut Villa Pierrefeu, had a tumultuous life. The Greek monarchy was abolished into 1973, and she spent decades in exile. But she used her position to work on charitable causes, particularly focused on children's welfare. She took the skills she learned about managing social obligations and directed them toward humanitarian work. Princess Irene of Greece and Denmark, another Villa Pierrefeu alumna, similarly dedicated herself to charitable work focusing on education and social welfare in various countries. These women were born into privilege, educated at the finest finishing schools, and then found themselves navigating very different lives than they had been prepared for. Exile, political upheaval, the loss of royal status, but they adapted. They took what they had learned about grace under pressure, about maintaining dignity in difficult circumstances, and they applied it to completely new situations. And then, of course, there is Princess Diana. We have talked about how unhappy she was at finishing school, how she begged to come home. But think about what happened later. Diana became arguably the most photographed woman in the world. She was constantly in the public eye, constantly being judged on her appearance and behaviour. and she was remarkably good at the public aspects of royal life. Not because she was naturally suited to it. By many accounts, she was quite shy and insecure, but because she had been trained. All those hours of deportment lessons, all that practice at formal events, all that emphasis on grace and presentation, it gave her tools she needed for life as a princess. But here is what makes Diana's story so powerful. She took those tools and used them in ways that royal protocol had never intended. She shook hands with AIDS patients at a time when people still believed you could catch the disease through casual contact. She walked through minefields to draw attention to the campaign to ban landmines. She hugged sick children in hospitals. She broke royal protocol constantly, and she did it deliberately, to make a point about compassion and human connection. The finishing school education was supposed to make women maintain proper distance, to be decorative but not too engaged, to follow rules. Diana took the confidence and poise that education had given her and used it to break those very rules, to insist on being fully human and fully present in ways that transformed the monarchy. Was she successful because of finishing school or in spite of it? Probably both. The education gave her skills, but her own character drove how she used those skills. Let me share something that I find absolutely fascinating. Many of the women who became famous writers, activists, or leaders after attending finishing schools later spoke or wrote about their education with mixed feelings. They acknowledged that they had learned useful things, made valuable friendships, gained confidence in some areas, but they also saw clearly the limitations of what they had been taught, the ways the system had tried to constrain them. This ability to take what was useful while rejecting what was harmful, to be grateful for genuine education while critical of the system that provided it, this seems like a valuable skill all on its own. A kind of critical thinking that the schools probably did not intend to teach, but that some students developed anyway. Barbara Lee Smith Bodichon, born in 1827, was educated by governesses and attended various private schools. She became a leading feminist, a painter, and an education reformer. She was instrumental in founding Girton College at Cambridge, one of the first women's colleges in England. She fought for women's property rights, for better education for royals, for women's suffrage. She took the art education she had received, which was supposed to be just an accomplishment, and became a serious painter whose work was exhibited and sold. She took the etiquette and social skills she had been taught and used them to move effectively in society while advocating for radical change. She understood the system from the inside, and that understanding made her a more effective critic and reformer. Florence Nightingale is another example. Born in 1820 into an upper-class family, she received the typical education for a girl of her class, including all the accomplishments. But she was deeply frustrated by the limitations placed on her. She wanted to do something meaningful, something useful. Her family opposed her desire to become a nurse, seeing it as inappropriate for someone of her status. But she persisted, and she revolutionized nursing and hospital care. She used her education, including her mathematical training, which had been unusual for a woman to receive, to analyze mortality rates and advocate for better sanitation in hospitals. She saved countless lives through her work. The education system tried to make her into a decorative society wife. She refused. But she used elements of that education, the writing skills, the ability to present herself authoritatively, the understanding of how to navigate bureaucracy and convince powerful men to listen to her, as tools in her revolutionary work. What all these stories tell us is something important. Education is unpredictable. You can design a system to produce one outcome, but you cannot control what students will actually do with what they learn. Some women took their finishing school education and did exactly what was expected, married well and ran elegant households. Others took the same education and built completely different lives. The difference was not in the education itself, but in the students. their personalities, their ambitions, their circumstances, their willingness to push against expectations. Finishing schools could provide tools and skills, but they could not determine how those tools would ultimately be used. And here is something else these stories reveal. The women who succeeded in unconventional ways often had support. Jane Austen had a father who valued education enough to sacrifice financially for it. Florence Nightingale eventually won over her family to support her nursing work. Jean Tierney had parents who allowed her to pursue acting. The Maharani of Jaipur had a husband who supported her political ambitions. The finishing school education alone was not enough. It took individual determination combined with at least some support from family or society to turn that education into something more than what was intended. But the fact that it happened at all, that women educated in institutions designed to limit them, went on to write novels that changed literature, to reform healthcare, to fight for social justice, to change politics, to break ground in the arts. This tells us something profound about the human spirit, about our capacity to take what we are given, even when it is inadequate or intended to constrain us, and make something meaningful from it. However, as we have been exploring these individual stories of triumph, we have been circling around a bigger question. Why did this system exist at all? What was really going on beneath the surface of all the etiquette lessons and flower arranging? The marriage market. That is what we have not fully examined yet. The economic and social machinery that finishing schools were designed to serve. Imagine trying to sell someone a very expensive education that will teach their daughter how to curtsy perfectly, arrange flowers beautifully, and eat tricky foods with impeccable manners. Now imagine that same daughter could instead go to university, study medicine or law or engineering and build an actual career. Which option do you think most families would choose? This was the question that finishing schools faced as the 19th century turned into the 20th, and it was a question that would ultimately destroy them. The decline of finishing schools was not sudden. It was not a single dramatic moment when all the doors closed and the students went home. It was gradual, a slow erosion that took decades to complete. But when you step back and look at the forces that caused this decline, you see something fascinating. You see the story of women themselves demanding more, refusing to accept the limitations that society had placed on them, and slowly, painfully, changing the entire structure of education and opportunity. Let me take you back to 1848, because this is where the seeds of change were planted. In London, a group of men and women who were sympathetic to the cause of women's education founded Queen's College. This was revolutionary. Not a finishing school teaching accomplishments, but an actual college offering serious academic subjects to women. The subjects included mathematics, not just household accounting but real mathematics, science, including chemistry and physics, Latin and Greek, the classical languages that had been reserved exclusively for boys, literature and history taught at a university level, not the superficial overview that finishing schools provided, philosophy, requiring students to think critically and argue logically. Queen's College was saying something radical. Women's minds are just as capable as men's minds. Women deserve the same quality of education. Intellectual development is not unwomanly or dangerous. It is necessary and valuable. 2 years later, in 1850, Miss Frances Mary Buss opened the North London Collegiate School. This was the first public day school for girls in England. Girls could attend, receive a rigorous academic education, and still live at home with their families. It proved that you did not need to send your daughter away to some expensive boarding school to give her a good education. Then in 1858, Miss Dorothea Beale became headmistress of Cheltenham Ladies' College, which had been founded in 1854. Under her leadership, Cheltenham became one of the premier academic institutions for girls in Britain. Beale was fierce in her belief that girls deserved the same intellectual challenges as boys. These three women, the founders and leaders of Queen's College, North London Collegiate and Cheltenham Ladies' College, they were revolutionaries. They were saying that the entire premise of finishing schools was wrong. Women did not need to be finished. They needed to be educated. Really educated with the same rigour and seriousness as men. And slowly, very slowly, people started to listen. By the 1870s and 1880s, women were being admitted to universities. Not many, and not always with the same rights as male students, but it was happening. Girton College at Cambridge was founded in 1869. Somerville College at Oxford opened in 1879. Lady Margaret Hall, also at Oxford, was established in 1878. The University of London began admitting women in 1878. Think about what this meant. A girl with intellectual ambitions no longer had to content herself with flower arranging and polite conversation. She could actually study. She could earn a degree. She could prove her capabilities in the same arenas where men proved theirs. The finishing schools tried to compete. Some of them added more academic subjects to their curricula. They started teaching more rigorous French and mathematics. They brought in university-educated teachers. But it was not enough, because fundamentally, they were still operating on the old assumption. The assumption that a woman's ultimate goal was marriage and education was just a way to make her more attractive in the marriage market. The new colleges and schools were operating on a completely different assumption. That women might want careers, that they might want to support themselves, that marriage might not be their only or even their primary goal. This was a paradigm shift, and finishing schools could not adapt to it without ceasing to be finishing schools. Now let me tell you about the Education Acts, because these were critical in changing the landscape. The Education Act of 1870 made elementary education compulsory for all children in England and Wales, both boys and girls. For the first time, the government was saying that every child, regardless of class or gender, deserved and required basic education. This might seem unrelated to finishing schools, which served wealthy families, not the working classes, but it was part of a broader shift in thinking. Education was no longer a luxury or an optional accomplishment. It was a right and a necessity. And if working-class girls needed education, how could anyone argue that upper-class girls should receive less academic training than their brothers? The Education Act of 1876 strengthened these requirements, and subsequent acts continued to expand access to education for all. By the early 20th century, the idea that girls should only learn accomplishments and etiquette was looking increasingly absurd to many people. But there was another force at work, perhaps even more powerful: the women's movement. Feminism in its various forms was challenging every assumption about women's roles and capabilities. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, women were organizing, protesting, demanding the vote, demanding property rights, demanding access to professions that had been closed to them. The suffragettes in Britain, the suffragists in the United States, they were making it impossible to ignore the question of women's equality. And with each gain, with each barrier broken, finishing schools looked more and more like relics of an outdated world. How could you justify teaching a girl to be decorative and agreeable when women were becoming doctors, lawyers, scientists, business owners? How could you tell her that her greatest ambition should be to attract a good husband when women were fighting for the right to control their own property, their own money, their own lives? The finishing schools that survived into the mid-20th century did so by adapting, by quietly shifting their focus. They emphasized the international aspects of their education, the fluency in multiple languages, the cultural literacy. They marketed themselves as preparing girls for global citizenship rather than just marriage. But even this was a tacit admission that the old model was dying. The 1960s were particularly brutal for finishing schools. This was the decade of women's liberation, of second-wave feminism. of young women burning their bras and demanding equality in every sphere of life. The very idea of a finishing school, of an institution designed to make women more marriageable, became not just outdated, but actively offensive to many people. Enrollment plummeted. Schools that had operated for decades, even centuries in some cases, suddenly found themselves with too few students to remain viable. The economics no longer worked. Wealthy families were sending their daughters to universities, not finishing schools. Let me give you some specific examples of what happened. Institut Alpin Vidmanet, the Swiss finishing school where Princess Diana had been so unhappy, it closed in 1991. After decades of educating wealthy girls from around the world, it simply could not continue. There were not enough students, and the ones who might have attended were going elsewhere. Chateau Montchoisy, that prestigious institution we talked about earlier, closed around 1995 or 96. One of the oldest and most respected finishing schools in Switzerland, gone. The building that had housed generations of young women learning etiquette and accomplishments was repurposed for other uses. School after school closed. In Lausanne, which had once been home to 45 finishing schools, they disappeared one by one. Some closed because they could not attract enough students. Others closed because of succession problems. There was no one in the younger generation willing to take over the family business of running a finishing school. Still others closed because the property they occupied became too valuable. The grand villas and estates could be sold for enormous sums, more money than the schools could ever make from tuition. By the late 1990s, only one traditional finishing school remained in Switzerland, Institut Villa Pierrefeu, and even it had to transform itself dramatically to survive. Under Viviane Nery's leadership, Villa Pierrefeu slowly shifted its mission. It was no longer about preparing girls to be wives. It was about preparing women to navigate international business and diplomacy. The curriculum was updated. Less emphasis on flower arranging, more on cross-cultural communication. Less focus on finding a husband, more on building a career in a globalized world. The student body changed too. In the 1950s and 60s, most students had been teenagers, girls taking a gap year between secondary school and marriage. By the 2000s, students ranged in age from 18 to 50. Many were already married, already established in careers. They were coming to Villa Pierrefeu not to catch husbands, but to polish their professional skills, to learn international protocol for business purposes, to network with other successful women. Even the language around the school changed. Viviane Nery famously said that they should not call it a finishing school, but a starting school, because they were starting students on a path of lifelong learning, not finishing their education. This rebranding was necessary for survival, but it also represented a complete inversion of the original purpose. Finishing schools had existed to end women's education and transition them into marriage. The new Villa Pierrefeu existed to continue women's education and help them in their careers. Same building, same location, completely opposite philosophy. But here is something I find fascinating. Even as traditional finishing schools were dying, some of their ideas persisted in new forms. Business etiquette courses became popular. Executive presence training, teaching professionals how to carry themselves with confidence and authority. Cross-cultural communication workshops for people working in international business. Image consulting, helping people understand how to present themselves effectively. All of these modern offerings, they echo finishing school curricula. The difference is that now they are marketed to both men and women. They are framed as professional development rather than marriage preparation, and they are understood as tools for career success rather than social necessity. So in a way, some of what finishing schools taught did have lasting value. Not the idea that women should be decorative and agreeable, but the practical skills of presentation, communication, and cultural literacy. These things matter in the modern world, but for very different reasons than the finishing schools originally taught them. Think about the irony here. The finishing schools said that etiquette and presentation were important because they would help you attract a wealthy husband. The modern equivalents say that etiquette and presentation are important because they will help you succeed in business and advance your career. Same skills, diametrically opposed purposes. This tells us something about education in general. Skills themselves are neutral. It is the context and purpose that give them meaning. Learning to speak confidently and move gracefully through a room, these can be tools of oppression, used to make women into decorative objects. Or they can be tools of empowerment, used to help anyone, regardless of gender, present themselves authoritatively and achieve their professional goals. The feminists of the 1960s and 70s were right to challenge finishing schools. The institutions were fundamentally based on limiting women's potential and funneling them toward one acceptable path, marriage and motherhood. That needed to be dismantled, and it was. But perhaps we can also acknowledge that some of what those schools taught, stripped of its sexist context and made available to everyone, remains useful. The ability to navigate different cultural contexts, the confidence to enter any room and feel you belong there, the skill to communicate effectively across differences. These are valuable in our interconnected world. The story of finishing school's decline is really a story about changing ideas of what women could and should be. Every time a new college for women opened, every time a woman gained the right to enter a profession that had been closed to her, every time a law changed to give women more control over their own lives and property, the foundation of finishing schools cracked a little more. Because if women could be doctors, why would they spend a year learning flower arranging? If women could vote and own property and run businesses, why would they focus all their energy on being pleasing to men? If women could support themselves, why was catching a wealthy husband treated as their only viable future? The finishing schools tried to answer these questions, tried to remain relevant, tried to adapt. A few succeeded, or at least survived in altered form, but most simply could not reconcile their original purpose with the changing world. And so they closed one after another, until they existed mainly as historical curiosities and plot devices in period dramas. There is something both sad and triumphant about this. Sad because these institutions, for all their flaws, were part of many women's lives. They were where friendships formed, where some women genuinely learned things that served them well, where memories were made. The loss of any institution carries with it the loss of a particular kind of experience and community, but triumphant because the reason they closed was that women demanded more, demanded better, demanded the right to define success on their own terms rather than society's terms. The decline of finishing schools marks the rise of women's opportunities. You cannot mourn one without celebrating the other. And yet, as we will see, the conversation is not quite finished. Because in the 21st century, something unexpected has happened. Finishing schools in new and updated forms have experienced a kind of revival. Not as marriage prep institutions, but as something altogether different. And that transformation tells us something important about both how far we have come and how much of the old world still lingers in the new. A businesswoman from Nigeria sits at a formal dining table in Switzerland. Next to her is a diplomat from Hong Kong. Across from them, a corporate executive from Mexico. They are all learning the same thing: how to navigate a 7-course French dinner, which fork to use for which course, how to signal to the servers without speaking. But this is not 1890, this is 2025. And these are not teenagers being prepared for marriage. These are accomplished professional women, some in their 30s, some in their 40s, even 50s, who have paid tens of thousands of dollars for a 6-week intensive course in international etiquette and protocol. Welcome to the finishing school of the 21st century. It is not what you might expect. Institut Villa Pierrefeu still stands on its hillside above Montreux, still offers courses in etiquette and deportment and formal dining. But walk into a classroom today and you will see something that would have shocked the Victorian founders of finishing schools. Students of all ages, from diverse countries and backgrounds, many of them already successful in business or diplomacy or hospitality management. And they are here not to catch husbands, but to advance their careers. Let me tell you how this transformation happened, because it is one of the most unexpected twists in our entire story. After the mass closings of the 1980s and 90s, Villa Pierrefeu was left as essentially the last traditional finishing school standing in Switzerland. Viviane Neri, who had taken over from her mother Dorette Faletas, faced a choice: close the school and sell the property, which would have made her very wealthy, or find a way to make the school relevant to a world that had completely changed since her mother had founded it in 1954. She chose transformation. The first major change was the student demographic. In 2012, Neri reported that enrolment from the United Kingdom, which had traditionally been the finishing school's primary market, was actually rising again. But now, students were also coming from Hong Kong, China, India, the Middle East, Latin America, Russia. The school had become truly international in a way it never had been before. Why were these women coming? Not because they lacked marriage prospects, obviously. Many were already married, already mothers. They were coming because in an increasingly globalized world, understanding international protocol and etiquette had become a professional asset, not just a social one. Think about a businesswoman from Beijing who needs to entertain European clients, or a diplomat from Brazil who will be posted to multiple countries throughout her career, or an event planner from Dubai who organizes high-profile international gatherings. These women need to know how dining etiquette differs between France and Britain and China and the United States. They need to understand gift-giving protocols, dress codes, the subtle variations in what is considered polite or rude across cultures. This is not about being decorative, this is about being effective, about not accidentally offending someone because you did not know that in Japan it is rude to blow your nose in public, but in Germany it is rude not to. About understanding that in some cultures, direct eye contact shows respect, while in others it is aggressive. The curriculum at Villa Pierrefeu adapted to reflect this new purpose. It still teaches formal dining, but now with explicit emphasis on the differences between American, European and Asian dining styles. It still teaches deportment and presentation, but frames it as executive presence and professional confidence. It still teaches flower arranging, but positions it as the event design and aesthetic sensibility. And here is something that would have been unthinkable in the old finishing schools. In 2013, Villa Pierrefeu opened its programs to men. Not as the primary audience, the school still focuses mainly on women, but men can now attend certain seminars. 5-day intensive courses on the European art of dining, for example, or household management for professionals who employ staff. Philippe Neri, Viviane's son, represents the third generation of family management. He oversees administration and strategy, and he's been instrumental in creating these co-educational programs. The school partnered with the Charles Macpherson Academy, which trains butlers and household managers, to develop courses that serve both personal and professional needs. Let me give you some specifics about what the modern Villa Pierrefeu offers, because it is quite different from what you might imagine. The International Etiquette and Protocol program is a 6-week residential course. Students, who must be at least 18 years old and female, study intensively. The program includes 216 hours of coursework. Half of it is devoted to French language instruction, because French is still considered essential for international diplomacy and high-level hospitality. The other half covers etiquette and protocol for 20 different countries. 20 countries, think about that! Students learn the specific customs, taboos, and expectations of cultures from Europe to Asia to the Middle East to the Americas. They learn how to greet people appropriately in each culture, how to dress, how to give and receive gifts, what topics are safe for conversation and which are dangerous. The course includes extensive practice, not just lectures about etiquette, but actual formal meals where students apply what they have learned. Tea ceremonies from different cultures, mock diplomatic receptions, practice at entering and exiting cars gracefully while wearing formal gowns, because if you are attending high-level events, photographers will be watching. And the cost? In 2012, the 6-week program cost approximately $36,387. That is more than many people earn in a year. But for the women who attend, it is seen as an investment in their careers, in their ability to operate confidently at the highest levels of international business and society. Who can afford this? Only the wealthy, obviously. But the definition of wealthy has changed. In the old days, finishing school students were daughters of inherited wealth, aristocracy, old money. Now, many students are from families that have built wealth in the last generation or two. Entrepreneurs, business leaders, successful professionals, new money, as it used to be dismissively called, and many students are paying their own way, viewing it as professional development. They are not being sent by their families to make themselves marriageable. They are choosing to attend because they see value in what the school offers for their own careers and lives. Beyond the flagship 6-week program, Villa Pierrefeu now offers shorter courses designed for working professionals who cannot take 6 weeks away from their lives. 3-week intensive programs, 1-week workshops, even weekend seminars for specific skills. But Villa Pierrefeu is not the only game in town anymore. The 21st century has seen a proliferation of finishing school-style programs, though they rarely call themselves finishing schools. Online finishing schools have emerged. Balisander Finishing School, for example, operates entirely online, offering programs that run from 11 to 21 weeks. Students from anywhere in the world can participate, studying etiquette, deportment, style, and cultural literacy from their own homes. The programs are not cheap, but they are more accessible than flying to Switzerland for 6 weeks. The online model opens up finishing school-style education to women who could never have afforded or accessed the traditional institutions. A woman in Australia or South Africa or Malaysia can now take courses that were once available only to those who could travel to Europe and pay enormous fees. Other programs have emerged focusing on specific professional niches. The British Butler Institute offers confidence and deportment courses aimed at service professionals. The Australian Finishing School provides workshops on business etiquette and social success. These are not broad finishing programs, but targeted skill development. There are even courses for children and teenagers, though with very different framing than the old finishing schools. They are marketed as confidence building and social skills development, not as marriage preparation. Parents are told that learning good manners and how to carry yourself with poise will help their children in job interviews, in college, in life, not that it will help them catch wealthy spouses. Now here is where things get interesting and a bit complicated. Is this revival a good thing or a problematic thing? The answer, I think, is that it depends entirely on the framing and the purpose. If finishing school-style education is marketed and used as a tool for professional effectiveness, available to anyone regardless of gender, focused on genuine skills like cross-cultural communication and confident presentation, then yes, it can be valuable. These are real skills that have real applications in our globalized, interconnected world. But if it is being used to reinforce old hierarchies, to signal class superiority, to teach people that their worth comes from how perfectly they perform certain social rituals, then it is just the old finishing school model in new clothes, and that is problematic. The question we need to ask is this: are these programs empowering people, giving them tools they can use to achieve their own goals? Or are they teaching people to perform a certain kind of elite identity that excludes others and reinforces existing power structures? I think the answer varies program by program, and perhaps even student by student. Two women might take the exact same course and derive completely different meanings and uses from it. One might use it to gain confidence in international business settings, to feel she can hold her own in any cultural context. Another might use it to signal her membership in an elite class, to separate herself from people she considers beneath her. The content is the same, but the purpose and effect can be radically different. What strikes me most about the modern revival of finishing schools is how much it reveals about what has changed and what has not changed in our world. We have come so far. Women can be CEOs, heads of state, astronauts, Supreme Court justices. No one today would seriously argue that women should not be educated or should not have careers, and yet there is still enormous pressure on women regarding their appearance and presentation. Women leaders are scrutinized for their clothing choices, their hairstyles, their voices, in ways that men simply are not. There are still unspoken rules about how women should look and act to be taken seriously in professional settings. So maybe it is not surprising that some women choose to study etiquette and deportment and presentation skills, not because they think these things are more important than competence or intelligence, but because they know that in the real world, perception matters. Fair or not, how you present yourself affects how others respond to you. A woman in a male-dominated industry might learn formal etiquette not because she loves finger bowls and fish forks, but because she knows that when she entertains important clients, her ability to navigate a formal business dinner smoothly is part of what makes her effective. It is armor, in a way. It is one less thing for anyone to criticize or dismiss her over. This is different from the Victorian finishing school student who learned the same things to make herself appealing to potential husbands. The skills look similar, but the motivation and the end goal are entirely different, and I think that difference matters. It is the difference between being shaped by external expectations and choosing to acquire skills that serve your own purposes. It is the difference between education that limits and education that empowers. But here is my concern. Even in its modern form, finishing school-style education is still primarily available only to the wealthy. The women attending Institut Villa-Pierrefeu and similar programs are not representative of women in general. They are an elite, and by virtue of their wealth and the education they can afford, they gain another advantage over women who cannot access these programs. So while the individual women attending might be empowered by what they learn, the existence of these exclusive, expensive programs reinforces broader inequalities. The social capital that comes from knowing the right fork to use, from moving gracefully in elite settings, from speaking multiple languages fluently, this capital is concentrated among those who already have financial capital. The finishing schools of the 21st century, for all their progressive reframing, still serve fundamentally the same function they always did. They help the already privileged navigate and succeed in elite spaces. They teach the codes and customs that separate insiders from outsiders. The difference is that now those insiders might be successful businesswomen rather than just the wives of successful businessmen. Progress, certainly, but not the whole story, and there is one more piece of this puzzle we need to examine. Because all of this education in etiquette and protocol, all of these rules about proper behavior across different cultures, they raise a fundamental question. What happens when you get it wrong? What are the actual consequences of cultural misunderstandings and etiquette mistakes in our globalized world? An American businesswoman arrives in Saudi Arabia for an important meeting. She has done her research, she thinks. She dresses conservatively, covers her hair, brings appropriate gifts for her hosts. The meeting seems to go well. But then, during the gift exchange, she makes a simple gesture. She offers the gift with her left hand, and she watches as the atmosphere in the room shifts, becomes noticeably cooler. The meeting ends politely but without the contract she had hoped to secure. Only later does someone quietly explain to her that in many Middle Eastern cultures, the left hand is considered unclean, used for personal hygiene. Offering a gift with the left hand, even unintentionally, can be deeply insulting. One small gesture, one moment of cultural ignorance, and a major business opportunity lost. This is why the modern finishing schools, for all their evolution and rebranding, still teach etiquette and protocol. Because in our globalized world, these small details can have enormous consequences. Not social embarrassment at a dinner party, though that can certainly still happen, but actual professional and diplomatic failures that cost money, damage relationships, and derail careers. Let me take you through some of the cultural differences that finishing schools like Institut Villa-Pierrefeu spend hours teaching their students to navigate. Because once you start looking at how differently the same gesture or action can be interpreted across cultures, you begin to understand why this knowledge might actually matter. Start with something as simple as a business card. In the United States or most of Europe, you hand someone your business card casually, maybe while continuing to talk about something else. You might stuff it in your pocket without really looking at it. You might write notes on the back of someone else's card. No big deal, right? Now try that in Japan. Hand someone a business card carelessly and you have just insulted them. In Japanese business culture, the exchange of business cards, called meishi kokan, is a small ceremony. You present your card with both hands, with the text facing the recipient so they can read it immediately. You bow slightly as you do this. When you receive someone else's card, you accept it with both hands, you study it carefully, you comment on it respectfully. You never write on someone's card in their presence, and you certainly never shove it in your back pocket. Why? Because in Japanese culture, the business card represents the person. Treating the card carelessly is treating the person carelessly. It shows disrespect, lack of awareness, and suggests you are not serious about the relationship. This is the kind of specific, detailed knowledge that can make or break an international business interaction. And it is exactly what modern finishing schools teach. Or consider gift giving. Seems straightforward, right? You want to show appreciation or respect, so you bring a gift. What could go wrong? In China, do not give clocks as gifts. The phrase for giving a clock sounds similar to the phrase for attending a funeral. It is associated with death and is considered deeply inauspicious. Also avoid gifts in sets of 4 because the word for 4 sounds like the word for death. White flowers are for funerals only. Umbrellas are bad luck because the word sounds like the word for separation. In parts of the Middle East, as we mentioned, never offer anything with your left hand. Also be very careful with gifts that might be seen as too personal or intimate if you are giving them to someone of the opposite sex. And in some Muslim countries, never give alcohol as a gift, as it is forbidden by religious law. In many Latin American countries, gifts of knives or scissors suggest you want to sever the relationship. Purple flowers are associated with funerals. Red flowers can suggest romantic interest when you might not intend that message. The list goes on and on. Each culture has its own complex web of meanings and associations attached to objects, colours, numbers, gestures, and if you do not know these meanings, you can accidentally send messages you never intended. Viviane Neri at Institut Villa-Pierrefeu has spoken about this specifically. She mentioned how journalists sometimes write embarrassing articles, criticising public figures for cultural mistakes they make. She gave the example of journalists criticising Melania Trump for not covering her head during a trip to Saudi Arabia in 2017. Neri pointed out that non-Muslim women are not required to cover their heads in Saudi Arabia. The journalists were wrong to criticise. But this incident illustrates how much confusion exists around cultural protocols and how easy it is to get things wrong or to judge others for things we ourselves do not understand. Let me share some more examples because they are fascinating and sometimes quite surprising. Eye contact. In Western cultures, particularly in the United States and Northern Europe, direct eye contact is considered a sign of honesty, confidence, and engagement. If you do not make eye contact, people might think you are shifty, untrustworthy, or not paying attention. Job interview advice in these cultures always includes maintain good eye contact. But in many Asian cultures, particularly in hierarchical interactions, prolonged direct eye contact can be seen as aggressive or disrespectful, especially when directed at someone older or higher in status. The polite thing is to lower your gaze occasionally, to show deference and respect. So imagine a Western business person who has been taught that eye contact equals professionalism, meeting with an Asian counterpart who has been taught that too much eye contact equals rudeness. Each person is following their own cultural script, and each might walk away thinking the other was behaving inappropriately. Or consider pointing. In Western cultures, pointing with your index finger is common and generally acceptable. In many parts of Asia and the Middle East, pointing directly at someone with your finger is considered very rude. In Malaysia, people point with their thumb instead. In other cultures, you gesture with your whole hand, palm up. Even something as universal as eating varies wildly. We have talked about the complexity of Western formal dining with all those forks and knives. But chopstick etiquette in East Asian cultures is equally complex and equally full of potential mistakes. Do not stick your chopsticks vertically into your rice bowl. This resembles incense sticks at a funeral and is associated with death. Do not pass food from chopstick to chopstick. This also resembles a funeral ritual. Do not point with your chopsticks or wave them around while talking. Do not spear food with them. Do not rest them across the top of your bowl in certain ways. The rules are extensive and specific, and all of this exists alongside the Western etiquette we have discussed. The fish fork, the soup spoon technique, the proper way to butter bread. A truly internationally literate person needs to know all of it, be able to switch seamlessly between cultural contexts. Here is one that I find particularly interesting. Silence. In Western business cultures, particularly American culture, silence in a conversation is often uncomfortable. We rush to fill silences. We interpret them as awkward or as signs that something is wrong. Negotiations proceed at a brisk pace with quick responses expected. In Japanese business culture, silence is valued. It gives people time to think, to consider their responses carefully. Rushing to fill every silence is seen as aggressive and thoughtless. Negotiations can involve long pauses that would make most Americans deeply uncomfortable, but these pauses are part of the process, not obstacles to it. An American business person negotiating in Japan might interpret silence as rejection or resistance, and might start making concessions unnecessarily just to get the other side talking again. A Japanese business person negotiating in America might feel pressured and rushed by the American need for constant verbal interaction. Neither approach is right or wrong, they're just different. But if you do not understand the difference, you can completely misread what is happening in the interaction. Personal space is another fascinating area of cultural variation. In many Northern European and North American cultures, people maintain a relatively large bubble of personal space. Standing too close to someone you do not know well can make them uncomfortable, can even be seen as aggressive or invasive. In many Latin American, Middle Eastern, and Southern European cultures, the comfortable distance for conversation is much closer. What feels friendly and engaged in these cultures can feel intrusive to someone from a culture that values more personal space. So you have situations where one person keeps stepping back to maintain their comfortable distance and the other person keeps stepping forward to maintain theirs, and both end up feeling like the other person is behaving strangely. Time is another huge cultural variable. In some cultures, punctuality is treated almost as a moral virtue. In Germany or Switzerland, if a meeting is scheduled for 3 o'clock, you arrive at 3 o'clock. Arriving at 3:10 would be considered rude and unprofessional. The meeting will start precisely on time whether you're there or not. In many other cultures, time is treated more flexibly. A 3 o'clock meeting might actually start at 3:30 or even later, and this is not considered a problem. Arriving exactly on time might even be seen as overly rigid or as showing that you have nothing better to do. Neither approach is better or worse, but if you do not know which system you're operating in, you can end up either frantically rushing or frustratedly waiting, all while thinking the other culture is being rude when they are just operating by their own norms. Now, here is the question all of this raises. Are these cultural differences genuinely important, or are they just arbitrary rules that we could all agree to ignore if we wanted to? I think the answer is that they are both. They are arbitrary in the sense that there is no inherent reason why pointing with your index finger should be fine in one culture and rude in another, or why 4 should be an unlucky number in Chinese but not in English. These meanings are socially constructed, invented by humans, not written into the fabric of the universe. But they are important because people assign importance to them. If someone from a culture where the left hand is considered unclean is deeply offended, when you offer them something with your left hand, your ignorance does not erase their offense. Your good intentions do not undo the bad impression you have made. So from a purely practical standpoint, if you want to interact successfully with people from other cultures, if you want to build relationships, do business, work diplomatically, you need to know and respect these norms, even if they seem arbitrary to you. This is what the modern finishing schools are selling. Not the idea that you will be a better person if you know which fork to use, but the practical reality that knowing which fork to use and which hand to offer a gift with, and how long to maintain eye contact and when to be silent, these things can help you be more effective in a globalized world. The criticism, and it is a valid one, is that this knowledge is still being treated as elite knowledge, available primarily to the wealthy. The businesswoman from Nigeria or the diplomat from Hong Kong who can afford 6 weeks at Institut Villa Pierrefeu will have advantages in international settings that someone who could not afford that education will not have. And there is something uncomfortable about that, because cultural knowledge should not be the exclusive property of the elite. In an ideal world, this kind of education would be widely available, taught in schools, accessible to anyone who needs it. But we do not live in that ideal world. We live in a world where cultural knowledge, like so many other forms of knowledge and skill, is often distributed unequally. And finishing schools, old and new, have always thrived on that inequality. Still, I want to end this part of our story with something hopeful. Because in the internet age, cultural knowledge is more accessible than it ever has been before. You do not need to go to Switzerland for 6 weeks to learn about business card etiquette in Japan or gift-giving taboos in China. That information is available online, often for free. Online finishing schools, YouTube tutorials, cultural competency blogs and podcasts. These resources are democratizing access to cultural knowledge in ways that would have been impossible even 20 years ago. The playing field is not level, not by a long shot, but it is more level than it used to be. And maybe that is the real legacy of finishing schools, both old and new. They started as institutions designed to maintain elite boundaries, to mark who was in and who was out. But in trying to adapt to the modern world, in being forced to market themselves as providers of useful skills rather than just markers of status, they have helped make the case that cultural literacy matters. And once you make that case, once you establish that these skills have value, it becomes harder to keep them exclusive. The knowledge spreads, the boundaries blur, the markers of elite status have to keep changing because they are no longer as exclusive as they once were. It is not a revolution, but it is a kind of slow, quiet progress. But we have been on quite a journey together, from the Victorian schoolrooms with their strict rules and flower arranging lessons, through the dark valleys of abuse and constraint, up to the Swiss mountains where modern women study international protocol. We have seen harm and resilience, oppression and adaptation, endings and unexpected new beginnings. Now it is time to bring all of these threads together, to step back and ask what this strange history of finishing schools tells us about education, about gender, about class, about how we prepare young people for the world and what we think that world should be. Stand with me for a moment on a hillside in Switzerland, looking down at Lake Geneva. The villa behind us is over a century old, built for a baroness who could not have imagined what her home would become. Inside, young women from every corner of the globe are learning how to navigate a world their great-grandmothers could never have dreamed of. They are studying international protocol not to catch husbands, but to lead companies, to represent nations, to build their own empires. This is where our journey ends, but also where so many other journeys begin. Because the story of finishing schools is not really over. It has transformed, evolved, taken on new shapes and new meanings, and what it teaches us, I think, goes far beyond etiquette and deportment. Let me share with you what I have learned from spending all this time in the world of finishing schools, from the Victorian era to today. Because these lessons, I believe, matter for anyone trying to understand education, gender, class, and the complicated ways we prepare people for the world. The first lesson is this. Education is never neutral. It is always shaped by assumptions about who the students are and what they should become. When the Victorians created finishing schools, they started from the assumption that women's highest calling was to be wives and mothers. Everything flowed from that assumption: the curriculum, the rules, the entire structure of the institution, and for a long time very few people questioned that assumption. It seemed natural, inevitable, just the way things were. But it was not natural or inevitable. It was a choice, a set of beliefs about women's capabilities and proper roles. And once those beliefs began to change, the entire edifice of finishing schools began to crumble. This tells us something important. When we create educational systems today, we are also making choices based on assumptions about what knowledge matters, about what skills are valuable, about what kind of people we are trying to create. And we should be aware of those assumptions, willing to examine them, ready to change them when they no longer serve us well. The second lesson is about the gap between stated purposes and actual effects. Finishing schools said they were preparing girls to be accomplished, refined, marriageable young women, and in many cases, that is exactly what they produced. But they also sometimes accidentally produced writers, activists, reformers, women who used their education in ways no one did. Jane Austen learned to play piano and speak French and arrange flowers, and she also learned to observe society with a sharp, critical eye and to write about it with devastating wit. Florence Nightingale learned all the accomplishments, and then she ignored them and revolutionized healthcare instead. The education intended to limit these women gave them tools they used for liberation. This is the unpredictability of human beings. You can try to shape people, to control what they learn and how they use it, but you cannot fully determine the outcome. People surprise you. They take what you give them and make something unexpected from it. And that unpredictability, that human capacity for agency and choice, it gives me hope. The third lesson is about the persistence of inequality. Finishing schools from their inception to today have been institutions for the privileged. They have taught skills and knowledge that help the already advantaged navigate elite spaces and succeed in them. The specific skills have changed. Flower arranging has given way to cross-cultural communication, but the fundamental dynamic remains. Access to this education is restricted by wealth, and that restricted access reinforces existing hierarchies. This is not unique to finishing schools, of course. Elite education of all kinds works this way. The question we need to keep asking is, what knowledge and skills should be available to everyone? And what knowledge are we allowing to remain the exclusive property of the wealthy? Because every time we restrict access to valuable knowledge, we are making inequality more entrenched. The fourth lesson is about resilience. The young women who attended finishing schools, who lived under all those rules and restrictions and expectations, many of them found ways to maintain their sense of self anyway. They smuggled books, they wrote coded letters, they formed deep friendships, they rebelled in small but significant ways. They refused to be entirely shaped by forces that sought to diminish them. And the women who were genuinely harmed by these institutions, who suffered abuse or neglect or psychological damage, many of them survived anyway. They built lives, they found meaning, they persisted. Human resilience in the face of systems designed to control and constrain, it is a powerful thing. But we should not romanticize this too much. Yes, people are resilient, but that does not excuse the harm. The fact that some women survived and thrived despite finishing schools does not mean the system was acceptable. Resilience is admirable, but it should not be necessary. We should create educational systems that support and empower, not systems that people have to be resilient to survive. The fifth lesson is about the complicated relationship between feminism and femininity. The decline of finishing schools was driven in large part by feminist critiques of the entire system. The idea that women should be educated primarily to be pleasing to men, that their value lay in their accomplishments and appearance rather than their capabilities and character, this was rightly challenged and ultimately rejected by most of society. But here is the complication. Some of what finishing schools taught, the confidence to enter any room and feel you belong, the ability to present yourself effectively, the skills to navigate different social and cultural contexts, these things can be genuinely valuable. They can be tools of empowerment, not just tools of oppression. So we are left with a question. How do we preserve what is valuable while rejecting what is harmful? How do we teach presentation skills and cultural literacy without teaching that women's worth is tied to how well they perform these skills? How do we help people develop confidence and poise without reinforcing the idea that some people are naturally superior to others? I do not have complete answers to these questions, but I think they are worth asking. The sixth lesson is about change. The world that created finishing schools, that world is gone. Women vote, own property, attend universities, enter any profession they choose. The idea that a woman's only path to security and status is through marriage seems absurd to most people today. This change happened because people fought for it, demanded it, refused to accept the limitations that had been placed on them. And the speed of this change, in historical terms, is remarkable. It took a long time, yes. Generations of women pushing against barriers, making incremental progress. But compare the world of 1850 to the world of 2025, and the transformation is staggering. What seemed unchangeable, eternal, natural, it changed completely. This tells us that the systems we live with today, the inequalities and injustices we see around us, they are not permanent either. They can change. They will change if enough people demand it and work for it. Now, let me bring us back to that villa in Switzerland, to Institut Villa Pierrefeu and the 4,200 women from 120 countries who have passed through its doors over the past 70 years. What is the legacy of this place and all the places like it? I think the legacy is mixed, complicated, full of contradictions. On one hand, finishing schools represented and reinforced some of the worst assumptions about women and their place in society. They taught that beauty mattered more than brains, that pleasing others mattered more than developing yourself, that your value was tied to your performance of a very specific kind of femininity. On the other hand, they were places where women gathered, learned, formed communities, where some exceptional teachers encouraged intellectual curiosity and creative expression, where young women sometimes discovered capabilities they didn't know they had, where friendships formed that lasted lifetimes. Both of these things are true. The harm and the help, the constraint and the unexpected liberation, the reinforcement of inequality, and the moments of genuine empowerment. History is messy like that. Institutions are rarely purely good or purely evil. They are human creations, full of contradictions because humans are full of contradictions. What we can do is learn from this history. Take what was valuable, the recognition that cultural literacy matters, that how we present ourselves affects how others respond to us, that there are skills worth learning about navigating different social contexts, but reject what was harmful, the idea that these skills are what make someone valuable, that they should be exclusive to the wealthy, that they should be used to reinforce hierarchies rather than help people connect across differences. The modern finishing schools, the ones that have survived by transforming themselves, they're trying to walk this line. They're trying to say we teach valuable skills for a globalized world, skills that anyone might benefit from, skills that can help you in your career and your life. But they are still expensive, still primarily accessible to the elite, still carrying echoes of the old world even as they try to serve the new one. Is this better than the old finishing schools? Absolutely. Is it perfect? Not even close, but it is a step, part of an ongoing conversation about what education should be and who it should serve. And maybe that is the real lesson, that education is always evolving, always being renegotiated. Every generation has to figure out what knowledge matters, what skills are worth teaching, how to prepare young people for a world that will be different from the one their teachers knew. There are no permanent answers, only ongoing questions. The villa on the hillside will probably still be there 100 years from now. Will it still be a finishing school? I do not know. Maybe it will have transformed again into something we cannot yet imagine. Maybe the whole concept of a finishing school will seem as quaint and outdated as it already does to many people. Or maybe there will always be a market for institutions that promise to teach you the secrets of success and status, the codes that separate insiders from outsiders. But whatever happens, the story will continue. Because the story of finishing schools is really a story about all of us, about how we decide what is worth teaching and learning, about the assumptions we make about different kinds of people and what they are capable of, about the ways we create and maintain social hierarchies and the ways we challenge and change them. It is a story about education as a tool of constraint and education as a tool of liberation, and how the same institution, sometimes the same lesson, can be both at once. It is a story about resilience and harm, about progress and persistence, about endings and unexpected new beginnings. And it is a story about young women, from the teenagers who learn to walk with books on their heads in Victorian drawing rooms to the accomplished professionals studying international protocol in Swiss villas today. Women navigating the expectations placed on them, sometimes conforming, sometimes rebelling, often doing both at once. Taking what they are given and making it into something more, something different, something their own. That capacity to take even limited tools and create something meaningful with them, to find agency even in constrained circumstances, to transform what is meant to limit you into what liberates you. That is the thread that runs through this entire story. And that is what gives me hope. Not just about finishing schools, but about human potential in general. We have been on quite a journey together tonight. Through grand estates and strict schoolrooms, through rebellion and resilience, through the rise and fall and strange revival of an institution that tried to finish women but could not quite manage it. I hope you have found something valuable in this story, something that makes you think differently about education, about gender, about the past and how it shapes the present. Thank you for staying with me through all of this. Thank you for listening as we explored the strange, fascinating, troubling and ultimately very human world of finishing schools. Your presence here, your willingness to engage with these ideas and this history, it matters more than you might think. If this story has sparked something in you, a question or a thought or a memory, I would love to hear about it. Leave a comment, share your reflections, tell me what surprised you or what you're still puzzling over. And if you found value in this journey, consider subscribing so you will not miss the next story we explore together, because there are so many more stories to tell, so many other corners of history that deserve to be examined, understood, learned from. The past is full of lessons for the present, if we're willing to look closely and think carefully. Until next time, sleep well, dream of transformation and possibility, and remember that you are more than any system designed to finish you. You are always endlessly beginning.